Chapter 37. Looking at the girl's back as she left, the boy looked away indifferently. Then he saw that there were a few water stains where she was standing barefoot. The boy looked at her silently for a while before closing the door. He came to the table and put on a pair of rimless glasses with his slender, white fingers. Then he continued to write his academic report with his pen. Halfway through, he heard a violent knocking sound on the door. Fu Yuheng continued to write unhurriedly. The handwriting on the tip of the pen didn't tremble slightly because of the knocking sound. It was probably when he was sure that the other party was going to kick him. Then, he casually took off the glasses with his fingertips. Then, he got up gracefully and walked towards the door. Wei Wei Bai was about to kick him. Then, she saw the door open. She retracted her foot and saw that the boy behind the door had an indifferent expression. His face was against the light in the room, and for a moment, he had an arrogant and cold expression. Of course, this expression turned into an indifferent and expressionless face in the blink of an eye.
His voice was calm.
"What's wrong?" The girl had already put on her clothes. Her knees were exposed on her tattered jeans. She was wearing a large sweater that seemed to be a man's size. It made her petite body look even cuter. The girl's skin was exceptionally good without makeup. It was white, tender, and crystal clear. This kind of cleanliness made the boy stare at her silently for half a second before calmly looking away. Wei Wei Bai crossed her arms and looked at him up and down. Then, she said coldly, "It's time to eat, big brother." The way she called him big brother was fierce. It was more like a protection fee leader who shouted that they were sworn brothers on the streets. Fu Yuheng's eyes were calm, but it was because of this calmness that he seemed even more distant. He was wearing a simple white shirt and black trousers. The buttons on his collar were meticulously buttoned. He was beautiful and noble, like a child raised in an elite family. His every move was polite and peaceful, but it was full of a noble sense of isolation. It was the complete opposite of Wei Wei Bai. His expression was still indifferent, and his tone didn't change at all. "You eat first." This kind of seemingly polite, but in fact extremely cold response was actually very annoying. Then, he put his fingers on the door handle and lowered his eyelashes to hide the cold light in his eyes. "Also, you can call me by my name in the future." This was to cut off any possibility of her calling him her brother. Wei Wei Bai glanced at him and pursed her red lips. She sneered, "Fu Yuheng, you're still so pretentious. If you hate me, just say it. Why are you so guarded against me? Do you think I would go to your bed to seduce you?" Fu Yuheng's eyelashes fluttered slightly as a ripple finally appeared in his eyes. He looked at her for a while before retracting his gaze. "I'm not sure. After all, your mother did it before." It was time to deal with his father. He used this move. He thought of his father's innocent appearance and could only sigh softly. Then, without any thought of dealing with her, he directly closed the door. He walked back to the table, sat down, picked up the pen, and was about to continue writing. However, he discovered that his state of mind had actually fluctuated a little, and he wasn't as calm as before. Fu Yuheng silently glanced at the report in his hand. Then he put the pen back. Just as he was about to pour a glass of ice water, his phone rang. He picked it up and saw that it was his father who was far away in France. Fu Yuheng calmly pressed the answer button and heard his father's voice on the other side.
There.
Chapter 38. "Yuheng, how are you getting along with Wei Wei? Wei Wei is a child. You have to be tolerant of her. I know you want her to leave our house, but she's a little girl and has nowhere to go. Xiaoyu is very worried about Wei Wei. You have to take care of her." Was she going to complain? He thought that a university acceptance letter would be enough to send her away. It seemed that this mother and daughter pair had big appetites. Fu Yuheng's face was cold, his eyelashes were slightly lowered, and his eyes were deep and cold. His voice was still gentle and calm. "I will take good care of her." The word "take care" had an inexplicable coldness in it. He didn't have time to say anything after paying. Xiaoyu still had to buy bags. He immediately hung up the phone. Fu Yuheng calmly made another call and heard the number reported to him. It was the number of money. How much Fu Qian spent on by Xiaoyu would be clear through the account. That person called by Xiuyu was Wei Wei Bai's mother. Because her father was unknown, Wei Wei Bai took her mother's surname. When Fu Yuheng heard the number, he didn't have much of a reaction. If it was a normal family, it would be a lot. But to the Fu family, this amount of money was just for daily necessities. So whether the other party bought 100 bags, a house, shoes, or all kinds of luxurious clothes, to them, they didn't feel anything at all. However, the other party probably didn't know the real wealth of the Fu family. If they knew, once they opened their mouth of greed, it wouldn't be so easy to appease them. Fu Yuheng put down the phone, opened the door, and went downstairs. At this time, Wei Wei Bai should have gone out. The teenager went downstairs and saw an empty living room. He calmly lowered his eyes and didn't say anything. When he walked to the kitchen, he saw that only the timed rice cooker had been moved in the kitchen. There were a few boxes of takeout dishes on the table. Nothing else had been touched, so the kitchen was still very clean. Fu Yuheng turned on the rice cooker, his gaze stopping on the black porridge. Then, as if to make sure that the other party used black rice and didn't cook it, he took out a spoon and stirred it. A terrifying smell assaulted his nostrils. Fu Yuheng was silent for a while before calmly covering the rice cooker back. When the cook came later, he would ask her to throw this pot away. Fu Yuheng poured a glass of water. Just as he was about to drink, he saw a note on the table. Placed on the table. He calmly walked over and pinched it with his fingertips. He casually glanced at it. The note, the girl's handwriting. Cute and beautiful. It wasn't ugly. He thought she couldn't read. Although it was just a verbal promise. Also, are you not planning to move away? I still need your guidance. Fu Yuheng looked at them with an indifferent expression for a while before casually throwing all the food and stickers into the trash can. Lu. Ding. The male lead's favorability is -8. Wei Wei Bai was eating fried dough sticks and soy milk in the breakfast shop when she heard the favorability notification. She smiled. Another stingy guy. Why didn't he give more points? The system couldn't see where to give more points. Especially that pot of death porridge. Full text TXT download to facilitate the next reading. You can click. Chapter 39. Who let him drink? -100 points. Wei Wei Bai had a tacit understanding. While eating the fried dough sticks, she explained, "This brother is very passionate. He has always been observing my character." Although it was not obvious. But Wei Wei Bai was used to observing others, and she had accumulated enough experience as an old employee. His nonchalant gaze was simply a blatant observation. After drinking a mouthful of soy milk. By Wei Wei, that's why I can't break my character too much. I have to separate from Bai Xiaoyu bit by bit. Although I only verbally promised to compensate him for the pot, it's already half a point better than my unsympathetic mother. Fu Yuheng's good attitude rose a little because he felt that at least she was not rotten to the core. In this world, she and Fu Yuheng had only interacted. It was just Bai Xiuyu. As long as she separated from Bai Xiaoyu bit by bit. When Fu Yuheng hated Bai Xiuyu, he did not include her. Then the favorability would not decrease. They didn't have any deep hatred for each other, such as the death of their fathers, the destruction of their families, or the resentment of their impotence. Half of this negative favorability was brought about by Xiuyu. The other -5 points was because she was too unrestrained, and the original owner was too stupid. It seemed that Fu Yuheng was also a person with extremely strong self-control, if his emotions were a little more irritable. Seeing the Bai family's mother and daughter, the negative favorability could fly to the sky. After Wei Wei Bai finished breakfast, she went out for a stroll. Then she thought of something and said, "Why is there no notification about Fu Yuheng's strategy?" It directly showed the favorability of the male lead. What about the time pending and the progress of the strategy 0? The system said, "Forgot to press the notification. Anyway, you know who the male lead is, and you know that the time is always pending, so you don't need to add numbers." Wei Wei Bai nodded. "Oh, got it." After wandering outside for a day, playing the amusement park, the spaceship, the haunted house, and the bumper cars, Wei Wei Bai calmly ate ice cream and went home. Back to Fu Yuheng's house. Because it was summer vacation, the temperature in the city was pleasant. But it was still a little hot. When Wei Wei Bai entered the house, she finished her ice cream and wiped her hands. Then, she saw that there was no one at home. Then, he took off his loose, thin sweater, revealing the little camisole underneath. Fu Yuheng, who had just come down the stairs, stopped in his tracks. He lowered his eyes and saw the girl's beautiful neck and the slightly damp water vapor on her round shoulders. The girl's face was a little red, and her forehead was covered in a thin layer of sweat. The air conditioner was on. She heaved a sigh of relief and sat on the sofa in her torn jeans. A light yellow sling wrapped around her body, revealing the girl's slender and beautiful waist. When the young man's gaze moved down, he happened to see her delicate shoulder blades and slightly trembling lines. A kind of exquisite and excessive beauty, exposed without warning. She was fragile, yet adorable. Fu Yuheng turned his face away indifferently and didn't look at her again. Instead, he turned around and went back upstairs. He didn't seem to want to see her. When he closed the door, his cold eyes darkened a little. After a moment of silence, he returned to the table. The notebook was open on the table. There were all kinds of densely packed stock data charts on it. In the contact group, there were already people saying, "It's time to start shorting. Let's start tonight." Fu Yuheng looked at the comments that flashed by quickly. As the person in charge of this plan, he was a little absent-minded. Then, he narrowed his eyes slightly, and his fingertips carelessly touched the plan report. The moment he slid his finger over, a thought flashed through his mind. He wondered if her skin felt like this white paper. Chapter 3040. Ding. The male lead's favorability is at -2. This favorability. Wei Wei Bai was watching TV. She smiled foolishly at the Peppa Pig that she did not finish watching last time. It was almost the same as the favorability of 2. She was very calm about this change in favorability. She purposely chose this time to come back. She even purposely came back when he was about to go downstairs. This world might not be a high-level world. The system could actually see some of the actions of the target at a very close distance. After all, Fu Yuheng looked calm and mature, but don't forget that he was only 1 year older than her. A 19-year-old boy. Drip, 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 a walking hot firearm. She did not believe that he could still be so calm when there was a beautiful girl in his house. A single man and a single woman. In the same room. They were still in the prime of their youth. If they did not do something, it would be a waste of this hot and beautiful summer vacation. Wei Wei Bai smiled and continued watching Peppa Pig. Dinner was prepared by the Fu family's nanny. 2 of them came. They did not live in the house. It seemed that Fu Yuheng was very territorial, so he did not allow outsiders to live in the house. Now, the only outsider living in the house was enjoying a big table of food. Fu Yuheng was eating in his room. He probably did not want to see her. Wei Wei Bai did not mind. After she finished eating, she went back to her room to tidy up. The room was too messy. Even if she wanted to be a delinquent girl, she should be the only delicate fairy among delinquents. After tidying up the room, Wei Wei Bai rushed downstairs with 2 big bags of trash. The young man walked out of the kitchen slowly. When he looked up, he saw the girl carrying the trash and brushing past him like a gust of wind. There was a faintly discernible soft fragrance, like candy hidden in the air. His eyes darkened for a moment before he turned to look at her. He saw that the girl's dyed hair was unusually smooth under the light, as if it was dyed with a halo. It had a honey color. Was her hair that good? The young man lowered his eyelashes indifferently, then slowly picked up the glass and drank a mouthful of ice water. When he returned to the room, he saw that the people in the group were boiling with excitement. Because of the successful short selling of the stock market, they had obtained a large amount of bonus funds. Fu Yuheng's face was calm. He casually opened his account and saw the frightening number. His expression did not change in the slightest as he slowly crossed his arms and closed his eyes tiredly. Suddenly, there was a familiar and annoying knocking on the door. Banging sounds rang out again. It was only then that he calmly raised his eyes, and the look in his eyes turned a little colder. Wei Wei Bai's hands were sore from knocking on the door. He was about to continue hammering. The door finally opened. Fu Yuheng was still wearing a meticulous white shirt and black trousers. There was not a trace of emotion in his cold eyes, and there was a kind of alienation that made people feel a little scared. But Wei Wei Bai didn't seem to see his unapproachable look. She squeezed through with the clothes in her arms. Fu Yuheng probably didn't expect her to be so bold. Caught off guard, she turned her body sideways and almost fell into his embrace. Her soft body and warm body bumped into his chest. Fu Yuheng frowned slightly and finally took a few steps back. His eyes were dark and he was about to let her out. But there was no chance, because Wei Wei Bai rushed into his bathroom with the clothes in her arms. Fu Yuheng, my shower head is broken. There is no hot water. Lend me your bathroom. After saying that, the bathroom door slammed shut. The young man standing at the door was silent for a while before he slowly closed the door. Chapter 30:41. Then he came to the bathroom door and was about to knock on the door to ask her to come out. But he heard the sound of running water. His dark eyes didn't reveal any surprise. He just stood at the door for a few seconds before turning around and walking away. When Wei Wei Bai came out, he looked up casually and saw Wei Wei Bai in a pink and green tank top and shorts. She was wiping her hair with his towel as she walked out. The girl's skin was dazzlingly white under the light. Her face was flushed, and her black almond eyes were bright. She was exceptionally beautiful. Fu Yuheng just looked up indifferently and looked at her for a while. Then he slowly looked away without saying anything. Wei Wei Bai ran to the table while wiping her hair. The water on her long hair dripped down her cheeks and fell on her slender neck. Fu Yuheng, thank you for letting me use the bathroom. She casually thanked him without any sincerity. Fu Yuheng was sorting out some reports. His expression was still cold, and his voice was calm. I'm done. You can go now. Wei Wei Bai raised her eyebrows and smiled. Why are you in such a hurry to chase me away? Don't you want a thank you gift? A thank you gift. Fu Yuheng's fingers paused as he touched the paper. He wanted to say with a smile that didn't look like a smile that she only had one more coin than a beggar. But he didn't say anything. A white and tender finger was already touching his delicate chin. The girl leaned over with a smile. Hey, why don't I give myself to you, brother? Fu Yuheng's expression was still indifferent. He didn't even move. His eyes were very dark, like the dark sea. This calm look made it hard for people to imagine that he was so young. He acted provocatively towards the girl. He reached out and gently held her wrist, rubbing his fingertips against hers. The young man's calm, thin lips finally curved into a mocking smile. His tone was a little dangerous. Oh, okay. After saying that, he clenched his fingers. He was so strong that Wei Wei Bai immediately frowned and sucked in a breath of cold air. Her eyes immediately turned fierce, and anger appeared on her beautiful white face. Fu Yuheng, let go of me. Fu Yuheng's eyes were deep, his thin lips moved slightly, and his tone carried a trace of casual coldness. Didn't you want to devote yourself to me? I'm not picky, so I'll accept all of you. A hint of panic appeared in Wei Wei Bai's clear eyes. She immediately became anxious. How can you be like this? Who would take it seriously? You're committing a crime. Fu Yuheng stared at her quietly for a few seconds and chuckled softly. I thought you were quite open-minded. This might just be a small matter to you. After all, it was the first time they had met, and she had brought a bottle of wine to his house with a yellow-haired hooligan. If he didn't come back. After they drank, something happened between them. Thinking of this, Fu Yuheng's eyes turned even colder. Wei Wei Bai only felt that the strength of his fingers had increased, and immediately struggled with all her might. Seeing her expression, he finally showed a trace of fear. Fu Yuheng wasn't in a hurry either. Instead, he dragged her over unhurriedly. Seeing that her entire body was about to be dragged onto the table by him, the girl in front of him suddenly said fiercely, Fu Yuheng, you hypocrite, bastard. After saying that, she lowered her head, opened her mouth, and bit his wrist with a whimper. Fu Yuheng's fingers froze, and the piercing pain came suddenly. Indeed, It was more of the girl's overly soft lips and slightly moist and warm contact. He frowned slightly, but still let go of her. Please forgive me for not updating for more than a week. There. Chapter 3042. Wei Wei Bai immediately jumped back like a rabbit. Then, her almond-shaped eyes were burning with anger. She opened her mouth several times, wanting to scold him, but she was at a loss for words. In the end, she could only threaten him dryly. Just you wait. If you dare to molest me, I won't let you off. Fu Yuheng turned his wrist slightly and looked down at the teeth marks on his wrist. His expression was calm. I want to see how you won't let me off. Are you going to complain? Little girl, if you complain too much, be careful that your mother thinks you're troublesome and chases you out. With Bai Xiuyu's personality, she didn't care much about her own daughter. Selfish people only cared about themselves. Then, he looked up indifferently and saw the fair little girl in front of him. Her crystal eyes were glaring at him fiercely. The corners of her eyes were red, as if she was angry. She hesitated a few times, but still snorted coldly. Don't think of chasing me away. You disgust me, so I'll stick to you. I'll walk in front of you, every day. I'll anger you to death. Fu Yuheng's gaze was cold. He took his time to pick up the glasses beside him and put them on casually. Then he picked up the pen. He looked like he didn't want to deal with her. Then do as you wish. I'm afraid you'll anger yourself to death when you see me every day. His movements were elegant and steady. His beautiful eyes gave off a deep and calm feeling. It was like an adult looking at an insensible child. His high and mighty expression made people feel pressured. Wei Wei Bai crossed her arms in front of her chest. Her tight green halter top pinched her waist thin. The skin on her arms was as white as milk. She had a fiery temper, but it made people think of white and soft pudding desserts. Her voice was sweet too. It wasn't the kind of coy, but fresh and natural. It was the unique sweetness of a young girl. It was just that the way she spoke was like eating chili. She said, "As long as my mother is here, I'll be here. Unless you chase my mother away, I'll be a hanged ghost hanging around your neck." Fu Yuheng only looked up briefly, paused, and then lowered his eyes silently again. The fountain pen on his finger drew circles on the paper unhurriedly. He didn't respond to her elementary school quarrel again. It was as if he was afraid that his IQ would be pulled down below the national average. Wei Wei Bai threw the towel in her hand onto his table and turned to leave. He even slammed the door shut. It was as if he could use the sound of the door to shatter Fu Yuheng's eardrums. Fu Yuheng looked at the closed door. There was also the young girl's childish and unconvinced look. He leaned back in his chair indifferently. His glasses slid down his nose, revealing his beautiful, dark eyes. He seemed to be thinking about her performance just now. He couldn't help but smile. Then he opened his laptop. There was a video call for a meeting. He casually turned it on. Then he heard his assistant say with a smile, "Young Master Fu, you seem to be in a good mood today. Did something good happen?" Fu Yuheng's mouth stiffened. Was it that obvious? Then he thought for a moment and replied calmly, "Oh, maybe I met a little hamster pretending to be a tiger and thought it was quite interesting." The assistant said casually, "You rarely watch short videos and the like. But usually when you study the financial industry deeply, your brain sometimes crashes. You do need some fast-paced entertainment to relax." He was just a little surprised that Fu Yuheng would watch Fast X and something like that. Otherwise, how could he watch a hamster pretending to be a tiger? Fast fast forward slash fast fast fast. Chapter 3043. The assistant also took the opportunity to recommend a few short videos of petting cats to Fu Yuheng. For example, one was a cat calling its owner a dog and wanting to eat fish. Cute or not? Surprise or not? Fu Yuheng looked at his assistant and suddenly suspected, how did he pretend to have a high IQ? But Wei Wei Bai's personality was unexpected. The girl in the data was a delinquent girl who caused trouble everywhere. Unbearably rude and low quality. It didn't seem that exaggerated. Ding, the male lead's favorability is at 5. The favorability jumped to 5. Wei Wei Bai was drinking fruit juice. When she heard the notification, She just calmly raised her eyebrows. It's good to slowly wash away the impression. These 5 points of favorability weren't much, but it was a good start. With Fu Yuheng's personality, he would only believe the results of his own observations. He must have investigated her, and by Xiuyu's information, Bai Xiuyu definitely couldn't wash away her innocence. It wasn't that she committed a heinous crime of murder or arson, but she was selfish, vain, and greedy for pleasure. Her seductive methods were shrewd and ruthless. She was still thinking about the image of an honest person with money. She definitely couldn't say anything. As for Weiwei Bai's information, she could only be thankful that she was young. Although she was a delinquent girl, she had done things like blocking people, bullying people, and drinking in bars and other bad things. But she didn't have time to make a big mistake. For example, she hadn't touched prostitution, gambling, or drugs. It could only be said that she was lucky. Otherwise, just washing her innocence would be a big project. So when she was with him, she just needed to let him know that although her personality was violent and impulsive, but it wasn't that her mind was evil and her heart was ugly. The favorability would naturally go up. After all, who would hate her because she was so cute? These 5 points of favorability were all because she was so beautiful. The system heard her praising herself. It once again calmly took out the 100 narcissistic sentences, and "You're the most beautiful. You're the most beautiful in the world," from the explosion of the universe to the collapse of the universe. This book was simply the best cost-effective thing he had ever bought. It could be used repeatedly until the host was old. Weiwei Bai was really happy. "You're also the cutest." The host and the system praised each other. Their friendship had suddenly reached a new height. After drinking the juice, Weiwei Bai, who was washing the cup, suddenly frowned. "I feel a little hot." The system looked at the temperature of the air conditioner and confirmed, "It's not hot." Weiwei Bai nodded calmly. After putting the blanket back, she slowly walked upstairs. When she reached the 2nd floor, she heard unhurried footsteps coming from the stairs of the 3rd floor. Weiwei Bai looked up. He saw a young man in a black suit, walking down slowly, while putting on a tie. His features were handsome and his eyes were cold. His slender fingers curled around the gray tie and slowly knotted it. His suit jacket was left unbuttoned, and when he was done with his tie, he buttoned it up. Perhaps it was because he was at home, so the young man was much more casual. Her beautiful eyes glanced sideways and saw Weiwei Bai. The girl's face was red. She was wearing a loose white translucent coat, and the light green straps were faintly discernible. Fu Yuheng's footsteps paused. His eyes fell on her face for a while before he continued walking. The young man was usually very neat and tidy. Now, he deliberately wore a black slim-fit suit, although his cold and pale face still had some traces of youthfulness. But one could see a sense of nobility in his every move. To facilitate the next reading, you can click on Chapter 3044. Weiwei Bai did not approach him. She was still dizzy. She felt like the sky was spinning. Fu Yuheng walked to her side and was about to continue walking downstairs. All of a sudden, the young girl beside him fell onto his body with a dong sound. The warm heat made him slightly stunned. Weiwei Bai immediately stood up straight. She did not stay on him for more than 3 seconds. Then, she touched her forehead and muttered in a daze, "My head hurts." Fu Yuheng looked at her obviously abnormal blush on her face. He lowered his eyelashes slightly and did not say anything. Then he ignored her and walked to the 1st floor. It seemed like he had something to do. Weiwei Bai touched her face. "I actually have a fever." The system finally had the time to say, "I thought you deliberately made yourself have a fever." She was so tanned outside and immediately took off her clothes when she was home, and the air conditioner was cold. She must have caught a cold. Not to mention strolling around in shorts and suspenders after taking a shower. It was like heaven for flu viruses. Weiwei Bai held her forehead. "I've been using the fever joke for so long. Am I the kind of person who doesn't know how to innovate? Why would I use it again and again?" The system. "No, you've used it many times." Weiwei Bai. "Oh, right." The system. I'm used to the host's shamelessness. I even think it's good. Bai Weiwei didn't really want to make herself sick and then win sympathy for this trick. It would make Fu Yuheng have a good impression of her. It was only 5 points of affection, so it might not work. She really had a fever. So she went to drink some hot water and took out the flu virus capsules. After reading the instructions, she ate a few. Then she walked to the 3rd floor. The system. Wait, you're in the wrong room. She opened Fu Yuheng's room. Weiwei Bai touched her face. Her voice was a little hoarse because of the discomfort. I'm running a fever. It'd be a waste not to use it. I might as well go warm his bed. Fever, wrong room. What was the difference between this and the old joke of walking into the wrong room when drunk? There was no sense of innovation at all. But it's fine as long as the host likes it. Weiwei Bai opened Fu Yuheng's door. Sure enough, it wasn't locked. After all, the time they spent together after he returned was very short. Therefore, he did not remember that there was someone at home that he needed to guard against. He let her into the room immediately. Weiwei Bai looked at Fu Yuheng's bed. It had a cold gray mattress, soft bedding, and a clean and large single pillow. Looking at the cool colors, there was a trace of that young man's aura. Weiwei Bai climbed onto his bed quietly. She then picked up his blanket and wrapped it around herself. Then they curled into a ball.
All right.
Sleep and warm the bed. The meeting lasted for a long time. After the meeting, Fu Yuheng went out for a party with a few important business partners. While drinking, he calmly looked at his disreputable friends and summoned a few high-class escorts. This was a private restaurant for the rich. There were private rooms in the restaurant. There were all kinds of services. One of the escorts wanted to come over, but was stopped by one of the partners.
Don't.
He's still a good student. Just let us off and call him Little Boss. They had worked together for several years and were very familiar with each other. They were not afraid of being teased. One of them was younger. She wore suitable light makeup and was dressed youthfully. She covered her mouth and snickered. Why is this little brother so reserved? He's also a college student. No one would take seriously the words of a whore in this carnival.
Tea.
Chapter 3045. However, this escort was indeed a little young and looked quite clean. Therefore, one of the work partners smiled and said, Brother Fu, why don't you bring one back tonight to have a good time? The escorts here. They were all strictly selected and had already been checked to ensure that there were no problems. There would be no problems with bringing back a night of spring breeze. Fu Yuheng was sitting calmly at the side. Under the light, the young man's side profile was perfect and exquisite. His eyelashes were thin and long. He looked like he had walked out of a movie with a youthful aura. He was the best dream lover hidden in everyone's hearts when they were young. The younger escort had only thought of it as a job. However, when she turned around, she was stunned. She pursed her lips. She was also someone who had seen the world, so she immediately put on the right smile. It was the pure look that others liked the most. She was about to walk over. However, she saw the young man calmly put down the wine glass in his hand on the table. It was a sound that was neither light nor heavy. Immediately, all the people who were laughing and joking immediately straightened their attitudes and sat up straight. Fu Yuheng looked up slightly and glanced at the young escort who was about to come over. The escort was indeed young. One could see that his face was full of youthful whites. However, he was already extremely experienced. His behavior were all trained. Fu Yuheng didn't know why he thought of the one at home. She was rude, like a little husky with a lion's head. She didn't understand the etiquette between men and women at all. She didn't know if it was dangerous to be alone with a man at home. She was really too careless. Fu Yuheng's thoughts paused slightly. Why should he worry about her? They weren't her parents. Fu Yuheng thought of Bai Xiaoyu and frowned slightly. Then, he stood up indifferently and picked up the black suit jacket on the back of the chair. It's about time. I should go back. Everyone immediately nodded and didn't dare to be as presumptuous as before. The young man's eyes were indifferent and even had a sense of alienation and nobility. Even if he didn't say a word, no one dared to be rash. Only then did Fu Yuheng walk out unhurriedly. He didn't even look at the escort who was coming over. When he reached the door, his footsteps paused slightly before he said calmly, "Remember to wake up early tomorrow. We have a remote meeting." After that, he calmly glanced at the watch on his wrist. "We'll start preparing at 6. It was almost 12:00. Coupled with drinking, waking up at 6:00 the next day was simply unbearable. However, no one made a sound. Even the sound of his breathing had become softer. After Fu Yuheng left, everyone let out a sigh of relief. Mom, the boss looks so young, but his aura is so scary." Another could not help but say, "Nonsense, old Master Fu raised him personally. Who doesn't know that he's the young master of the Fu family? He's only working with us now because he's helping the people at the grassroots level." The Fu family kept a low profile, but everyone in the industry knew that this was the business empire of the behemoth. Given Fu Qian's personality, many people thought that the Fu family was finished. In the end, he did not expect that he would give birth to the most awesome successor. Now, the Fu family's resources were all on Fu Yuheng. Everyone knew how high the status of the person they served was. But Little Boss is really amazing. That's right. If the Fu family has a successor, we will be able to do better. When the young hostess heard these words, she could not help but grit her teeth. She leaned over and whispered, "Is he very good?" Chapter 3046. This sentence was immediately met with ridicule. "It's none of your business. I haven't seen Little Boss get close to any woman, let alone a woman from a brothel." The Fu family was very strict. They were a real aristocratic family. Their rules were notoriously strict. Fu Yuheng's every action was like that of a child from a big family. One of his colleagues said, "We had too much fun just now. Sigh, I really don't want to live anymore to introduce an escort to Little Boss." Everyone was in a bad mood, because he had to wake up at 6 tomorrow, and that escort couldn't help but secretly clench her fists. There was a faint trace of unwillingness on her face. When Fu Yuheng returned home, it was already slightly smoky. He opened the door slowly. He saw that the lights in the living room were all on, but there was no one. It should be the nanny who turned on the lights. After the nanny left, no one would turn it on. He glanced around indifferently before slowly walking up the stairs. When he reached the second floor, he looked at the door of the room in the corridor. He suddenly remembered that before he left, her face was abnormally red. After a moment of silence, only then did Fu Yuheng leisurely walk to the door and knock on it. He waited for a moment.
There was no sound.
He raised his hand again and knocked a second time unhurriedly. There was still no sound. Fu Yuheng looked down indifferently. She should be asleep. Then he turned and walked up to the third floor. He didn't care whether she was sick or not. She was just a little troublemaker, just like her vain mother.
There would be a day when it would be solved.
In less than a year, Wei Bai and Bai Xiaoyu would probably disappear from his life. Fu Yuheng rubbed the bridge of his nose as he thought about it. He drank a little too much today. It made him feel a little dizzy. He opened the door with one hand. As he walked, he threw the jacket in his hand on the sofa and pulled open the collar with his fair fingers. Fu Yuheng felt a little uncomfortable and didn't pay much attention to his surroundings. He went straight to the bathroom. He took off his clothes as he walked. Tie, shirt, and even his watch were thrown on the floor. The topless youth's fair body was still slightly thin compared to that of an adult male. His legs, which were clad in black trousers, were long and straight. He casually reached out and combed his short black hair, letting the neatly combed hairstyle fall apart. His dark eyes were slightly smoky. His usual noble and strict appearance now had a bit more of a carefree and unrestrained look. He opened the bathroom door, but didn't close it. He went straight to the shower. Wei Bai heard the sound of water and opened her eyes in a daze. Then, she turned over and wrapped herself in the blanket. It was so cold. She pursed her lips and struggled to keep her eyelids open. "How high is my fever?" The system replied, "Almost 39. Wei Bai, why do I feel cold?" The system said, "That's what happens when you have a fever. Look at yourself, your IQ is gone." Wei Wei Bai said, "My mind is clear." The system said, "Forget about the strategy. Let's go to sleep." The host's spirit of persevering despite having a fever was too heartbreaking. Wei Wei Bai, "I'm not sleeping, I'm not sleeping, I'm not sleeping." The system was speechless. The host was confused by the fever. He quietly went to look for products in the supermarket to see if there were any fever medicine that humans could take. In the bathroom, the sound of water stopped. The young man held a large white towel and walked out of the bathroom naked. Because he raised his hand, the faint lines of muscles on his arm were exposed. His good-looking eyes were steamy, and there was a trace of exquisite beauty. The young man at this moment was completely different from his usual calm, gentle, and perfect image. His beautiful eyes looked up slightly, cold and deep. After drying his hair, he still felt a little dizzy. He reached out and rubbed his forehead. Without looking, he sat on the bed and lay down naked. He closed his eyes, and a strange soft fragrance seemed to linger at the tip of his nose. Fu Yuheng's thoughts were much slower, but he didn't think much about it. Suddenly, his fingers touched something soft, and he was stunned. Then, a petite figure turned over in the blanket and rolled into his arms. It was soft and hot. The is at https://m/sashu.com/the comma. Chapter 30:47. Fu Yuheng was stunned. Because of the alcohol, his reaction was slower, and he did not push her away for a moment. The girl's body was unusually hot. She was too close, and her breath brushed past his slightly cold skin, bringing about a slight itch. She seemed to be very uncomfortable. Her bright red lips were lightly pursed, and the tip of her nose let out a soft moan. Soft and indescribably pitiful. Fu Yuheng was silent for a moment before he finally realized something. He frowned and reached out to push her away. Suddenly, the girl in his arms felt even more uncomfortable. If she had squeezed into his arms to seek warmth because of the cold just now. At this moment, she suddenly felt like she was on fire. So she frowned angrily, closed her eyes, and raised her leg fiercely, wanting to kick Fu Yuheng's waist. Almost instinctively, Fu Yuheng retreated. However, he didn't expect that he would roll off the bed and onto the floor in an instant. Fortunately, the ground was covered with a gray velvet carpet. He did not hurt, but he was a little stunned. He frowned. Because of the sudden accident, his brain, which was sluggish because of the alcohol, suddenly sobered up. The young man's face suddenly became a little ugly. He reached out to the side of the bed and jumped up from the ground. Then he saw that the girl had already rolled out of the blanket. Her delicate face was full of an abnormal blush. Because of the heat, she kicked the blanket away. Her slender, white calves were exposed from the blanket. Delicate ankles, pink toes, and even the skin on her legs was a little red. Fu Yuheng looked at her expressionlessly. Realizing that she was just confused by the fever, he snorted and lay flat again with his eyes closed. The girl's breathing was a little heavy. It should be very uncomfortable. He pursed his lips, then turned around and put on his clothes without any expression. After putting on his loose pajamas, he frowned. Then he came to the side of the bed, wanting to carry her up and throw her into her own room. Then he would call the family doctor over. A rational procedure flashed through his mind. The young man's eyes were incomparably cold, without any sympathy for someone who was sick. Just as his fingertips touched her arm, the scalding temperature made him frown. Very tall. Her sleeping face was leaning against the soft bedding. Her head of dyed, honey-like hair was messily scattered on the pillow. The quilt was thrown away, revealing the little camisole she was wearing underneath. She exposed her fragile neck and beautiful collarbone without any precaution. Under the light, her white skin had a delicate luster like that of a pearl, and on top of the pearl, there was a layer of light powder. Fu Yuheng was silent for a while. Only then did he continue his actions, as if nothing had happened. He had just bent down to embrace her in his arms, and before he could get up, the girl in his arms suddenly opened her eyes in a daze. Her beautiful eyes were not as clear and bright as usual. Instead, it was soft and hazy. Her eyelashes were half closed and the corners of her eyes were red. Suddenly, she pursed her lips, wrinkled her nose, and tears flowed from her eyes. She reached out and grabbed his clothes, the side of her face resting on his chest. Her breathing was trembling, and she was sobbing. "Mom, did you come to see me?" She cried softly, and her forbearance made one's heart ache. "I'm sick. Why didn't you come to see me? I won't make trouble anymore. Don't abandon me. Did you change uncles again? I don't like them. They're all bad people." Fu Yuheng's movements stiffened, and his breathing became heavier. Chapter 30:48. He couldn't describe what it felt like. The little girl hid in his arms and cried. "I'm sick, but you don't even look at me. I'm sick," sob, 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 sob. Over and over again, she could only say that she was pitifully sick. It was as if she only had this small bargaining chip, using her body to gain sympathy, to gain the care of her mother, by Suyu. The little girl, who was confused by the fever, sounded pitiful. She didn't even realize who she was hugging. Her usual rebellious and arrogant spirit only wanted to beg for a little care at this moment. Fu Yuheng lowered his eyes and didn't say anything. He didn't comfort her at all. He just quietly maintained the posture of hugging her. After a long time, she gradually calmed down. Because she was too tired, the crying choked in her throat and disappeared again. He was silent for a while before looking at her. The girl who was leaning against him had a red face, and the tip of her beautiful nose was slightly red. The small sling slid from her shoulders to the bottom of her shoulders. A beautiful curve was faintly revealed from the camisole. The young man looked at it indifferently, and then looked away indifferently. Then he carried her and took 2 steps towards the door. The girl in his arms groaned in discomfort. Her voice was vague and weak. He stopped in his tracks and was silent for 2 seconds. Then he pursed his lips, turned back, and put her on his bed. The girl lay back softly in the middle of his dark and soft bed. Fu Yuheng sighed helplessly and then went out to call the doctor. Then he went to rummage through the medical kit and took out a fever patch and an ear temperature gun. He was used to drinking cold water. There was no hot water at home. So he rolled up his sleeves and calmly went to the kitchen to find a brand new kettle. After opening the packaging, he washed it clean and boiled a kettle of water. When he returned to the room, he saw that the girl was lying on her side and groaning in discomfort. Fu Yuheng, with a cold face, walked over and measured her temperature. When his fingertips brushed past her soft and small ears, she obviously trembled. Sensitive belt. The young man's eyes were still deep and indifferent, but there was an imperceptible fluctuation in his eyes. He retracted his finger as if nothing had happened. The temperature was around 38 degrees Celsius, almost 39 degrees Celsius. He was burning up badly. Fu Yuheng reached out and touched her forehead. Then, he stuck the fever patch on her forehead. The girl was obviously not used to the sudden change in temperature. The strong chill made her whole body tremble. Fu Yuheng paused for a moment, but he continued to stick it on. However, his finger pressed on the fever patch. His palms were dry and warm, giving her a comforting warmth. She was soft, as if she was a small animal that was seeking coolness. She couldn't help but reach out and grab his wrist, placing his palm beside her cheek. The girl's face was smooth and soft, giving off the comfortable feeling of a baby's skin. His fingertips paused, and he couldn't help but rub her skin. She shuddered again. Then, she frowned and her eyelashes trembled. The young man's eyes darkened, and he didn't continue. Instead, he went to find some fever medicine and water. He fed her some warm water. He lowered his head to read the instructions for the fever medicine. He then thought about whether she had taken other drugs. If it was less than 4 hours, there might be a conflict. At this moment, the doctor also arrived. Before Fu Yuheng went to open the door, he thought of something and returned to the bedside. He saw the girl's exposed skin. The sling exposed her body too much. The skin on her shoulders and collarbones was not covered at all. / to make it easier for you to read it next time, you can click. Chapter 30:49. He lowered his eyes and glanced at her. Finally, He sighed lightly, took one of his large shirts, and put it on her. He lowered his head, and his fair fingertips gently and meticulously buttoned her shirt. He buttoned the buttons one by one, his fair fingers occasionally touching her skin. However, he acted as if nothing had happened, as if he was not affected. He calmly buttoned the top of the collar. Then, he covered her with the blanket. Then, he took a look at the little girl, whose face was still red with a fever patch, wrapped tightly in the blanket. Her brows were still furrowed, and she looked aggrieved. Fu Yuheng looked at her indifferently for a few seconds before calmly turning around to let the doctor in. She had caught a cold and had a fever. The doctor took a look, took her temperature, and prescribed medicine on the spot after checking. He asked if he needed to contact the family nurse to take care of her for the night. Fu Yuheng stood aside indifferently and was silent for a while. Then he said calmly, "No need." He paused for a while. Then he added, "There are people who will take care of her." After the doctor left, Fu Yuheng took out the medicine list and counted the pills on the list. It was confirmed. He carried the water and reached out to half-carry her. She leaned softly on his shoulder, her eyelashes slightly lowered, as if she was about to wake up, but she was too uncomfortable to even open her eyes. Fu Yuheng reached out and patted her face. "Take the medicine before you sleep." His voice was low and had a kind of indifferent laziness. After softening, it felt more like coaxing a child. Wei Bai struggled to open her eyes. Her eyes were still red, and there was still moisture on her eyelashes. She looked at him in a daze for a while, then gently rubbed his shoulder. "Bitter, don't take it." Her voice was soft and muffled. It felt like she was acting coquettishly. Fu Yuheng was silent for a while before pursing his lips. In the end, he succumbed to her childish words. His voice also softened. "It's not bitter, it's candy." Wei Bai muttered, "You're lying." Fu Yuheng said calmly, "How do you know I'm lying?" Wei Bai. Fu Yuheng was very patient. "If you eat it, won't you be able to confirm that I'm not lying?" When Wei Bai heard this, she felt that it made sense. Then, she opened her mouth obediently. After swallowing the medicine, he frowned. "You're lying." Fu Yuheng's face was calm. "Yes, I lied." Wei Bai turned over and struggled to roll into the blanket. Then, she hugged the blanket and buried her face in it. "I don't make friends with liars," she muttered unhappily. Fu Yuheng reached out and rubbed his forehead. He felt that childishness was simply contagious. He said softly, "It just so happens that I don't want to be friends with you." After saying that, he pulled the blanket up. He covered her up tightly. She closed her eyes and once again fell into a deep sleep. Fu Yuheng lowered his eyes and looked at her for a few seconds before leaning against the bed and exhaling lightly. When did he become so kind-hearted? He actually had the patience to take care of a little girl. Fu Yuheng suddenly remembered that she was only 1 year younger than him. It wasn't appropriate to call her a little girl. Thinking of this, the little girl suddenly turned over again. She restlessly stretched out her hand from under the blanket and felt for his fingertips that were hanging on the bed. She held on to them and didn't let go. The warm fingertips softly hooked onto his fingers, causing the cold youth to be stunned. He stared at her silently for a while. Although his eyes were deep, there was no coldness that didn't concern him. In the end, he didn't pull his hand back. He let her hold it. Ding, the male lead's favorability has increased to 10. Chapter 3050. The morning light slowly shone in from the window. Her fever had subsided. Fu Yuheng pulled off the earphones and turned off the lights. The lights in the room were gone. Only the morning light was left, and it was somewhat dim. The teenager walked to the bedside. His beautiful eyes looked calm and peaceful under the shadows. He reached out and touched the girl's forehead gently. He only moved his hand away after making sure that her temperature was normal. Her eyes were closed, and her hair was messy on the pillow. Fu Yuheng calmly reached out and tidied up her hair on the pillow. When his fingertips slid across her smooth cheeks, his eyes darkened, but he did not say anything and retracted his fingers. Then, he pulled the blanket over her again and covered her tightly. After doing all this, Fu Yuheng calmly walked to the table and continued to put the earphones in his ears. It was a remote video on the computer. A group of people with unkempt hair and dirty faces were eating breakfast sandwiches. Some were drinking coffee, and some were yawning. They saw that the teenager had returned for a meeting. They all sat up straight. Those who were eating sandwiches hurriedly stuffed them under the table and dropped them on the floor. Fu Yuheng pretended not to see. The handsome teenager's hair was a little messy. Although his clothes were neat, there were some wrinkles. It seemed that he did not have time to iron them when he put them on. He stretched out his hand and pulled at his collar lazily, but did not unbutton it. He only loosened his collar a little. He said, "Let's continue with the meeting." He said to wake up for the meeting at 6, and he was ready at 5. At 5:30, everyone was dug out of their warm beds by Fu Yuheng. Was little boss Fu a robot that did not need to sleep? Fu Yuheng was very calm as he organized the documents and continued with the meeting. The summer morning was always bright. The sun had already shone on the bed. Fu Yuheng did not notice. The nanny had also been called over by him early in the morning and was preparing breakfast. He organized everything in an orderly manner. Even if Wei Wei Bai was tormenting him, it only added a shadow under his eyes from staying up late. He was still very energetic. The meeting was about to end. Fu Yuheng was about to end the meeting and wanted to get up to see if the porridge the nanny made was ready. In the end, before he could say anything, he suddenly paused because he didn't know when, but the girl's face was pale and her beautiful brows were furrowed. She was standing behind his chair. She seemed to be too weak and couldn't hold on any longer. She reached out and pressed on the back of his chair. Coincidentally, the sunlight fell on the side of her face, giving her delicate skin a beautiful halo. Her beautiful honey-colored hair was loose and disheveled. It made her look even more pure and adorable. On the other hand, the loose white shirt she was wearing gave her a sense of contrast and seductiveness. The moment she appeared, everyone fell silent. Fu Yuheng also paused and turned to look at him. Bai Weiwei was at a loss. She reached out and rubbed her eyes. Her soft voice mumbled vaguely, "I'm hungry." Her voice was vague and delicate as it lightly brushed past the young man's ear. Only then did he react and turn to look at the video. Sure enough, he saw a bunch of people staring at them with their mouths agape, especially looking at her. Fu Yuheng's face suddenly turned gloomy. He turned the camera and said in a deep voice, "Dismissed." After saying that, he hesitated for a moment before explaining, "It's my sister." After saying that, he felt that he had made an unnecessary move. Chapter 30:51. Not to mention that Wei Wei Bai was not his sister. Even if she was, what was the point of explaining it to them? He left the meeting with a gloomy expression and pulled off his earphones. Just as he was about to say something, he saw Wei Wei Bai sprawled on the chair behind him, her hands almost powerlessly grabbing onto his chair. She had no strength left. She was on the verge of collapsing. Fu Yuheng watched expressionlessly as she got up from the chair. Her entire body went limp and fell to the ground along with his chair. The young girl was wearing his clothes, her beautiful calves peeking out from under the clothes. Her beautiful appearance was as fragile as a little lamb. She frowned as if she wanted to stand up, but she slipped back into her seat. Her dazed look was actually very comical. She was at a loss for a while before she angrily hammered the floor and tried to get up for the third time. The young man who couldn't stand it had already sighed faintly. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing his exquisite wrist bones. Then he bent down and hugged her waist, lifting her soft body up easily. Wei Wei Bai's face leaned against his chest. Under the smooth fabric of his clothes, the young man's steady heartbeat could be heard. Fu Yuheng put her on the bed and pulled the blanket away. He was about to ask her to sit properly, but he saw her looking up at him, as if she was very troubled. Her face was red, and there was an inexplicable throbbing in her eyes. This shy look. Fu Yuheng was stunned. In the end, Wei Wei Bai immediately lowered her head and said fiercely, "I'm hungry." She was simply a little ingrate. Fu Yuheng, who had taken care of her for the entire night, was so angry that he laughed. Did she think he was a servant? He was about to throw her out. But suddenly, he felt the corner of his clothes being gently pinched by her fingers. She lowered her head, and her voice became weak. Brother, this call of brother was not mocking. It was not joking, nor was it sarcastic words said in anger. It was a kind of expectation, even a soft call. Fu Yuheng. He stared coldly at the top of her head and then looked down at her half-closed eyelashes. Thick eyelashes trembled slightly. She seemed very nervous. Fu Yuheng didn't say anything, but calmly said, "Let go." Wei Wei Bai's fingertips trembled slightly before she hesitantly let go. However, she grabbed it again. She looked up and her temper flared up again. "I'm not letting go." The young man stared at her silently, his dark eyes without a trace of emotion. Wei Wei Bai blushed again. She awkwardly loosened her fingers and snorted. "What's so great about it? I can't even catch it." Fu Yuheng's face was calm as he reached out to flatten his clothes. She stood up straight and said, "You're hungry. The nanny will bring you food and medicine later. I still have work to do. You can go back to your room after you're done eating." Wei Wei Bai was sitting on his bed. When she heard this, she looked up and glared at him. Fu Yuheng. What a fierce and ungrateful wretch. He shouldn't have been soft-hearted towards her. His tone turned colder. "If you really hate me that much, you can leave any time. I'll give you a sum of money. As long as you don't squander it, it'll be enough for you to finish college." With that said, he calmly and elegantly adjusted his collar, without looking at her. He then took his suit jacket from the hanger and planned to make a trip to the office. Old Master wanted to assess his performance recently, so he had to deal with it. Just as he opened the door, he suddenly sensed something and turned sideways. A pillow hit the door. Then the girl's cold voice came from behind him. "Who cares about your money? Why are you so nice to me? You should have let me burn you to death last night, bastard." Fu Yuheng stood there indifferently. Without saying anything, he opened the door and walked out. He slammed the door. He lost control of his strength, and the sound was actually a little loud. The nanny who was walking over with breakfast was shocked and looked at him strangely. After all, Fu Yuheng had always been calm and elegant. His every move was especially gentle. It was almost impossible for him to slam the door. Fu Yuheng walked over expressionlessly and brushed past the nanny. He stopped in his tracks and said in a low voice, "Remember to let her take her medicine." To make it easier for you to read it next time, you can click on save, comma. Chapter 3052. After Fu Yuheng left, Wei Wei Bai rubbed her face. Her head was spinning. She didn't have much of an impression of what she did last night. She seemed to have caught him and complained tearfully. What was she crying about? Wei Wei Bai tried hard to recall and realized that she had used too many cliché tricks. They were imprinted in her bones. She cried like a pitiful girl without her mother, a rebellious girl who lacked love in her childhood. She thirsted for love, causing her personality to deviate. Wei Wei Bai nodded.
It was a cliché.
But it was still useful to deal with people like Yuheng. She had to get rid of Bai Xiuyu as soon as possible. At least in Fu Yuheng's eyes, she couldn't think of Bai Xiuyu whenever he saw her. Wei Wei Bai lay back on the bed. There was the fresh scent of a young man on the bed. Then she heard the door open. It was the nanny. She brought breakfast and medicine. After Wei Wei Bai finished eating, she continued to sleep. The system checked her temperature from time to time, afraid that the illness would relapse. Fortunately, the host's body was young and had a good immune system. By night time, she had almost recovered, except for the soreness from the fever. There were no major problems. Wei Wei Bai was very relaxed in the Fu family. She was the most relaxed in this ordinary modern world. After dinner, she sat in front of the computer and started to play games. She had a small blanket draped over her body and was still wearing shorts. Her hair was messy and uncombed. She looked like a bad girl who wanted to hit someone. When Fu Yuheng came back, it was almost 10:30 p.m. The nanny had left before 10 p.m. When he came back, he saw the empty living room. He habitually untied his tie and thought about the meeting with the old master. The old master's last words were still echoing in his ears. If it weren't for your father, you wouldn't have to suffer like this. You've suffered too much at your age. Fu Yuheng didn't feel much about the old master's words. After all, he knew that his father was unreliable since he was young. Now that Bai Xiuyu's incident happened, he wasn't angry or surprised. He was just a little tired sometimes. Fu Yuheng took off his jacket. He had eaten, but he ate with business partners. He was not full. The nanny should have left supper for him, but he was too lazy to enter the kitchen. Instead, he walked straight up the stairs. He didn't even realize that he was walking faster than before. When he reached the second floor, his footsteps paused. He glanced at her room and was silent for a few seconds before he walked upstairs expressionlessly. After all, she was Bai Xiuyu's daughter. He did not intend to have too much interaction with her. Fu Yuheng rubbed his forehead tiredly and opened the door to his room. I found the light on. There was also the sound of typing on the keyboard. Fu Yuheng's expression was cold. His fingers rested on the doorknob, but he didn't close the door. Leaving the door half open, he rolled up his sleeves as he walked forward. His cold eyes became a little colder. She was still in his room and had even turned on his computer. Did they intend to collect the business information in his computer or deliberately destroy his computer? Fu Yuheng thought calmly. When he reached the table, he saw that the girl had a small blanket draped over her body and her messy long hair casually draped over her shoulders. She was wearing shorts and sitting cross-legged on his chair. Her slender body leaned forward, and her face was pale, giving off a sense of fragility. Her fingers were typing rapidly on the keyboard. She was too focused. Even when he stood in front of her for a long time, she didn't even look up. Chapter 3053. Fu Yuheng reached out and pressed the top of the computer screen gently with his fair fingers. Wei Bai still did not see it and was focused on the computer screen. His gaze turned cold, and he was about to say something. However, he saw Wei Bai's brows suddenly furrow. Her originally dispirited eyes lit up because of anger. She pursed her lips and started typing furiously while muttering, "If you don't know how to play games, go and study hard. Have you finished your summer homework? It's so late, and you're not sleeping. Why are you playing games?" "What? You're not a primary school student? You're not a primary school student. Aren't you embarrassed to be so bad at games? You're cheating your teammates." Fu Yuheng, who was used as a background for the first time, stood in front of the table and looked at her silently. Then, he glanced sideways and saw from the corner of his eyes. On his computer screen, there was a colorful moving image. It was a computer game. It was not here to destroy his computer, nor was it here to steal business information. Wei Bai was scolding her primary school student teammate. A fair and beautiful hand suddenly landed on the keyboard, and her fingertips moved towards the exit button. That finger was just about to press down. Wei Bai had already reached out and grabbed his wrist quickly. She hurriedly said, "Have mercy. Let me finish this round first." Fu Yuheng's gaze landed on her fingers. The girl's fingers were unusually slender and did not have much strength. Even if she grabbed his wrist, it was not threatening at all. It felt like he could pinch her fingers. She could not struggle at all. This thought flashed through his mind and was suppressed by the young man silently. Then, without any expression, he exerted force on his fingertips and the game automatically exited. After exiting the game, he lowered his eyes slightly. Then, he reached out and pressed his fingertips against her fingers, prying them apart one by one. Wei Bai stared at his actions and did not wait for him to finish before she retracted her fingers. She even wiped her hands on the blanket at the same time. She was even more disgusted than him. Fu Yuheng looked up indifferently and looked at her for a few seconds before suddenly reaching out and carrying her. This action was very fast. The blanket on her body fell off, revealing her tight short-sleeved shirt. Fu Yuheng glanced at her clothes and moved his eyes away. Then, he carried her to the door and put her on the ground. She looked at him in confusion. The boy gripped the doorknob indifferently and slammed it. He closed the door. Wei Bai. "Yo, little guy, you have quite the character." Suddenly, the door opened again. The young man stood sideways inside the door, indifferently throwing the blanket that she had just draped over her head. Then she said, "If you wear so little next time and have a fever, I'll charge you medical fees." His tone was cold and emotionless. After Fu Yuheng finished speaking, he slammed the door again. Wei Bai slowly pulled the blanket off her head. Her hair was already messy enough. It was like a bird's nest. Fortunately, the quality of her hair was good. She still looked like a little fairy even after she smoothed her hair. Her favorable impression of him was at -10. It seemed like her favorable impression of him was at -10. Wei Bai didn't feel anything either. She rubbed her stomach and went to eat supper. There was no need to rush the strategy. How could she work if she didn't eat? She casually called out to Tongzi, but there was no response. He probably went to rest. Wei Bai went to the kitchen and saw that there were some things that she had to heat up herself. She put a few cold, hard-boiled eggs into the microwave oven. Then, she yawned and opened the thermos flask to see what was inside. She was searching for bowls and chopsticks. Then, she heard footsteps. She looked up and saw a slender figure walking out of the kitchen door. Fu Yuheng didn't seem to expect that she would be here. He stopped in his tracks and lowered his eyes indifferently, ignoring her. Then, he opened the refrigerator and went to get mineral water. Wei Bai rolled her eyes at him, clearly showing that she didn't want to see him. She took out a bowl and was about to look at the eggs. Then she heard
Bang!
a sound like a small bomb was heard. She was confused. The next moment, her entire body was pulled by a huge force, and she crashed directly into a warm embrace. Chapter 3054. Wei Bai was leaning against the young man's chest, looking up at his delicate jawline and slightly tight lips. His fingers were tightly pressed against her waist. His side was facing the microwave, and his dark eyes were fixed on it. Wei Bai looked up and was about to say something.
Bang!
Another explosion was heard. Fu Yuheng didn't even think about it. He carried her by the waist and strode to the kitchen. They left the dangerous kitchen. He threw Wei Bai on the sofa, rolled up his sleeves, and ran into the kitchen to turn off the microwave. The egg in the microwave had turned into a small bomb. If not handled properly, it would be very dangerous. Seeing what Fu Yuheng did, Wei Bai was at a loss for a moment. Why did the egg explode? The system said, 9 out of 10 eggs in the microwave will explode. Wei Bai said, "You didn't remind me." The system said, "I just fell asleep." She squinted her eyes and heard the sound of an explosion. She thought that the host had come up with some shocking old trick and was torturing people. For example, a bomb to cripple Fu Yuheng. If she had the company of redemption, wouldn't the favorability increase? She looked and realized that the host had entered the kitchen again. Luckily, she came back early and Fu Yuheng was there too. Otherwise, the kitchen would be ruined by the host. Wei Bai quietly took out her phone and checked, then said calmly, "So it really does explode." The system was speechless. The host's knowledge of the kitchen was like a retard. The system said that it was used to it. Fu Yuheng cleaned up the kitchen, then took a tissue to wipe his fingers and walked out. He saw Wei Bai curled up on the sofa, her face on her knees like a little girl. There was a trace of embarrassment on her fair and tender face. Her pair of beautiful round eyes looked at him eagerly. He stopped in his tracks. He felt like a kitten that did something wrong and was begging for forgiveness. She was obviously a troublemaker. Fu Yuheng suppressed the dissatisfaction in his heart. His voice was colder. "You're hungry. There's still pork rib porridge in the rice cooker. Why did you touch the microwave?" Wei Bai was silent for a while, then said, "I want to eat eggs." Fu Yuheng was speechless. This reason was too direct and powerful. He couldn't refute it. The young man stood in the living room. His slender figure was so handsome under the light. Wei Bai looked up and saw his cold, white face. Meanwhile, Fu Yuheng's indifferent eyes coincidentally met her gaze. Wei Bai's eyes. She immediately looked away, as if she wanted to hide something, and said, "I won't eat eggs in the future, okay?" The little girl's childish annoyance could be heard from her tone. But she couldn't bring herself to apologize. Fu Yuheng wasn't going to argue with her. He was older than her, so he still had some tolerance for her. Otherwise, he would have grabbed her and thrown her out of the house. She was left to her own devices. She had nothing to do with him. Fu Yuheng turned and walked into the kitchen expressionlessly. For someone like him who had a strong sense of territory, it was already surprising that he could tolerate her here. Wei Wei Bai saw him walk into the kitchen. Her face was still so pitiful. She rubbed her stomach, sigh. Fu Yuheng won't be so heartless as to eat all the supper in the kitchen and let me starve. The system glanced at her. He's scrambling eggs. Wei Wei Bai smiled. Scrambled eggs? Chapter 30:55. System. Because the eggs were cooked for too long, they were cooked faster. Wei Wei Bai supported her face with her hands. Looks like this brother is quite cold on the outside. Did he see that his poor sister didn't have food and wanted to eat eggs, so he deliberately cooked them with a cold face? Fu Yuheng, this guy, was actually quite kind. Or maybe it was because of his high favorability. It finally showed its pitiful effect. She sat on the sofa for a while, then jumped up from the sofa and ran to the kitchen door. She saw Fu Yuheng putting the poached eggs on a plate. The pork rib porridge in the rice cooker was sticky and fragrant. The way the young man quietly served the porridge was unusually virtuous and cute. Wei Wei Bai thought for a while, then asked, "Do you need my help?" Fu Yuheng looked up at her indifferently, then sneered. Of course, his good upbringing made him sneer only for a moment. It made it difficult for her to flare up. She was worried that she was seeing things. He took out his chopsticks. "If you want to eat, then eat quickly." After saying that, he paused for a few seconds, then calmly explained, "This supper is also for you. It's all thanks to the nanny." Wei Wei Bai crossed her arms and walked into the kitchen with a cold face in her slippers. Fu Yuheng didn't care about her anymore. He started to pull out a chair, sat down, then quietly picked up the spoon to eat the porridge. The quiet young man held the porcelain spoon with his white fingers. The lines of his finger bones were unusually beautiful. This pair of hands was like a work of art, as if they could play the piano, but it didn't look like they could cook at all. Wei Wei Bai looked curiously at the poached eggs on the table. The design was nice, and it looked delicious. Wei Wei Bai tried to hold it in, but she couldn't help it. She was hungry, so she didn't have the face. She pulled out the chair herself, then picked up the spoon in the bowl and drank a mouthful. It was indeed fragrant and sticky. Her shriveled belly always felt a little warmer. Then she put the spoon down, picked up the chopsticks, and was about to pick up the egg. But she saw the young man slowly move the plate away. Then, with a calm expression, he picked up the plate and poured the poached egg into his bowl. Wei Wei Bai held her chopsticks. Fu Yuheng looked up indifferently. His black eyes were deep and calm. "If you want to eat, make it yourself." After that, he began to eat slowly. In front of Wei Wei Bai, he gracefully ate the egg bit by bit. Wei Wei Bai, killing people and destroying their hearts. Eat porridge with eggs. Fu Yuheng didn't stand on ceremony at all. Since he said he would eat, he finished it himself. After he finished eating, he calmly placed his bowl and chopsticks in the sink. Then, she began to wash the dishes. Wei Wei Bai also finished the porridge in a few mouthfuls and then happily put the bowl into the sink. He wasn't embarrassed at all. Sure enough, Fu Yuheng paused and looked at her slowly. Wei Wei Bai also looked at him matter-of-factly. He was like an ancestor. Fu Yuheng's eyes darkened, and he gripped the bowl a little harder. In the end, he pursed his lips and continued to wash the dishes. His fair wrists were splashed with water droplets, and a few drops even fell on his sleeves. Wei Wei Bai looked and asked without much sincerity, "Do you need help?" Fu Yuheng put the bowl in the filter basket next to the sink. Just as he reached out to pick up the plate, when he heard her words, he paused. He looked at her quietly. Under his long and narrow eyelashes, his eyes were deep. Then, Wei Wei Bai saw his thin lips curl slightly. His voice was cold and disapproving. "What can you help with, young lady?" There was obviously a hidden meaning in his words. It seemed like he was scolding her for not being able to do anything right. She couldn't help with anything. Wei Wei Bai was stunned. She didn't seem to be able to react for a moment. Fu Yuheng didn't expect her IQ to be able to understand the coldness in his words. He calmly turned around and continued to pick up the plate. Just as he was about to put it in the basket, suddenly, he felt the girl's body close to him. He was stunned. When he turned around instinctively, she had already knocked into his arms. He took a step back, but found that he was pressed against the edge of the sink and couldn't retreat. However, Wei Bai reached out. Her fair and tender fingertips tugged at his collar forcefully. The youth's collar was pulled open. He was not prepared for her actions and lowered his head. Under his beautiful neck, the lines of his collarbone were faintly prominent. The girl was already in a vengeful mood. One hand hooked around his neck. She raised her head and opened her mouth, sucking on his thin and soft lips. This wasn't a kiss. It was a deliberate collision. Just like the cracked egg, it was filled with an inexplicable sense of extravagance. Fu Yuheng's pupils shrank. His lips and tongue were filled with the girl's soft and fragrant breath. Without waiting for him to push her away, she had already backed away. Her eyes were dark and bright with a trace of moisture. Her beautiful lips were even redder. Wei Bai reached out her fingertips and brushed them across her lips carelessly. She raised her head and looked at him provocatively. "What can I help with? I can cheer you on." After saying that, she revealed a sly smile that bordered on naughty. "How about this cheering kiss?" Chapter 3056. This sudden kiss stunned Fu Yuheng for a moment. Then he looked at her expressionlessly. Wei Bai took 2 steps back indifferently. Her face was still pale, and there was a hint of haggard fatigue in her eyes. It was the color left behind after a cold and fever. However, there was a smile in her eyes after she had succeeded. Her eyes were bright and clear, and they were exceptionally beautiful. Wei Bai pursed her lips. There was a hint of ambiguity on her bright red lips. She smiled without caring at all. As if the prank had succeeded, she said, "Then wash the dishes properly, brother." Her brother's tone was a little harsh. It was filled with slight ridicule. Then she didn't hesitate. She walked towards the kitchen door in her slippers. Fu Yuheng's gaze fell on her slender back. When she walked out, the light shone on the tip of her ear. It was actually a reddish color. Light and pink. Exceptionally delicious. Fu Yuheng's eyes darkened. Then he lowered his head lightly and reached his fingers into the water again. He picked up the plate that had slipped out of his hand because of the sudden attack. He slowly and calmly put the bowls, chopsticks, and plates away. Then he picked up a tissue and wiped his hands unhurriedly. After wiping, he walked to the trash can and threw away the tissue. There were eggs in the trash can that he had thrown away. They were yellow and white. They had all exploded in the microwave. The microwave hadn't been processed yet. His fingers didn't often touch the oil. The only thing he was sure of was that he could cook beautiful food. Other than poached eggs, it was pasta. He thought about how he had acted like a child just now and deliberately made eggs to anger her. He would almost never do such a childish thing. Fu Yuheng frowned slightly. He stood quietly for a while before slowly walking away. He turned off the lights in the living room. Shadows covered his body. The beautiful youth stood in the dark living room with his eyes lowered. Then, as if he had realized something, he pursed his lips lightly. There were still remnants on it. The scent of a young girl. The youth's eyes were deep. His usual cold and elegant appearance had a hint of lazy evilness. He walked up to the second floor. He didn't stop there. Instead, he went upstairs and entered his room. When the door was closed, his fingers did not fasten on the lock. Because he had to deal with some documents, he turned on the computer, and there was an unfamiliar game on the desktop. He moved the mouse and was just about to uninstall. However, he thought of something. He looked at it silently for 2 seconds before moving his mouse away. He did not delete the game. Ding, the male lead's favorability is at 12. Wei Bai's cold was a little recurrent, but she didn't take her health lightly. Wearing long sleeves and holding a hot water bottle every day. After all, young people had strong immune systems. If they drank enough water, they would be able to recover. Her nose was a little uncomfortable because of the cold. This caused the tip of his nose to turn slightly red. For some reason, he looked as pitiful as a deer. The few times Fu Yuheng saw her, his gaze would always stop at the tip of her nose and then move away. The rebellious girl Wei Wei Bai immediately glared at him. Fu Yuheng's impression of her. It was changing little by little. At least he didn't tell her to scram. He did not mention Bai Xiuyu again. But that was it. There were no extra actions or feelings. Wei Wei Bai was not in a hurry. As long as she could get rid of Bai Xiuyu, it would be fine.
And she was not in a good state now.
The time was pending. She was not in a hurry to splash dog blood or anything. Chapter 30:57. Thinking back to the previous world, it would take a month or 3 months. That bit of time forced her to spin around like a top. Now, the years were peaceful and long. The system heard this. You're just lazy. The host really didn't care about transmigration. In the past, he still felt nervous. Now, he and the host had become big salted fish. They couldn't move at all. Although it wasn't to the extent of not doing anything, they weren't as desperate as before. The system didn't whip them. There was nothing to whip them. After all, they had a pile of life points in their hands. They were no longer desperados with no room for retreat like before. Just as Wei Wei Bai was a salted fish, Fu Yuheng became busy. Recently, the old man had been dragging him to meetings. All kinds of internal reforms in the company were imminent. The old man planned to solve all these things before retiring. But he didn't have enough stamina. He could only let him do all the dirty work and the most difficult work. He originally thought that if he didn't graduate early and went to school according to the rules, he could avoid these heavy work for a year or 2. In the end, it all piled up for him during the summer vacation. Fu Yuheng had just taken the lead to deal with a few senior members of the company and let them retire. He was so tired that he just wanted to go home. But the old man pulled him to look through the pictures of blind dates. He looked at the women in the picture book and felt a sense of irritation and disgust. Grandpa, work is fine, but there's no need for these. The old man patted the picture book. Listen to me. Don't be like your father. He wants freedom for everything. Look at how useless freedom is. Speaking of his father, Fu Yuheng's eyes were cold and unmoved. The old man said, You're still young. I'm just letting you choose now. I'm not forcing you to get married. Fu Yuheng threw the picture book aside. Then he stood up and picked up his suit jacket. A corner of his mask, which had always been gentle to the outside, cracked, revealing the gloomy coldness within. Marriage is my personal problem. I'll solve it myself. During this time, I'll continue to promote the company's reform plan and temporarily put down the business of the company I founded. When the company is done, you can rest in peace after retirement. At this point, Fu Yuheng lowered his voice and was incomparably calm. After that, I will be responsible for my own life and affairs. Grandfather, you don't have to worry about me. This sentence was tantamount to rejecting the old man's control over his future. The handsome young man slightly tilted his head as he looked at people. He was so strong and cold that no one could refute him. It didn't seem like he was discussing with someone. It was more like he was giving an order. The person who was listening was the old man who was holding a walking stick. His fingers gently stroked the walking stick. In the end, he just smiled. You're still young. There's still a restless little vixen hiding in your house. It's a little surprising that you didn't get rid of her. After all, he was a man. This was especially true for youngsters of Fu Yuheng's age. Clearly, his methods were so ruthless and calm, and he handled things more skillfully than any old fox. Everyone who looked down on his age had fallen into his trap. Everyone thought that he was the one who came up with the plans behind the scenes, while Fu Yuheng was only in charge of being the puppet on the surface. But only old Master Fu knew that from the beginning to the end, he was the one resting. These plans, each and every one of them, were the ideas of his grandson, pushing forward and solving. //T. Chapter 30:58. Even an old man like him was pushed out as a shield by him. After all, everyone who was kicked out of the company by his grandson would hate him. Now everyone knew that he was the mastermind behind the scenes. Fu Yuheng was using the young man as a shield to protect himself. He was someone who could take advantage of every aspect and solve every problem. Would he not be able to chase away a little girl? Fu Yuheng reached out and began to put on his suit jacket. His fair fingers meticulously buttoned up the buttons slowly. Although his beautiful and slender body was not as strong and tall as an adult male, he had a noble and elegant posture, revealing a faint explosive power. He casually reached out and adjusted his tie. His voice was a little hoarse. The house is a little empty. When I'm bored, watching a cat or a hamster running around is also a way to pass the time. These words were frivolous and undisciplined. There was a disdainful look on his face. The girl at home did not seem to have any ripples in his heart. When the old man heard this, he smiled in satisfaction. Well, Grandpa is relieved to see you like this. It's fine to just play. At the end of the year, when you and your father settle down and send the mother and daughter abroad, give them a sum of money as our Fu family's kindness to them. Fu Yuheng nodded casually, as if he did not care. Then, he picked up his briefcase and put the infinity glasses on the table on the bridge of his nose. The young man's outfit looked more mature. She was also much more obedient. When he was at work, he looked harmless. He used this appearance to deceive many of the old shareholders of the company. Until they were all kicked out of the company, this group of old antiques did not believe that they were defeated by the young man. Fu Yuheng left the company and called his group of partners. He told them that he would temporarily postpone the various projects in his company and wait until school started. He was busy during the summer vacation. In the end, there was a fearless roar on the other side. Little boss, are you in love? Fuck, is it your first love? Hee hee, is it the sister from last time? She's so pretty. Little boss has high standards. Because the other side of the phone was on speaker mode. It was like a party. Fu Yuheng listened expressionlessly for half a minute before slowly saying, "Tonight, we'll have a remote meeting at 12:00 to deal with some of the work that has accumulated recently. After all, I've been busy recently. Before I leave, I'll help you deal with these chores." There was a moment of silence on the other side. Suddenly, there was a burst of howling and begging for mercy. Fu Yuheng's thin lips curved slightly, and he said calmly, "Don't sleep until you're done." After that, he hung up the phone expressionlessly. The accumulated work over the past few days was enough to torment them for an entire night. When Fu Yuheng drove home, it was already 10:00. When he opened the door, he saw that the light in the living room was on. The young man walked in with an indifferent expression. He tugged at his tie and loosened the 2 buttons on his collar, revealing his beautiful white neck and sexy Adam's apple. When he threw his briefcase on the sofa, he suddenly heard a burst of soothing music. The pure music was very slow and beautiful. When he entered the door just now, Fu Yuheng suddenly realized that something was wrong. He narrowed his eyes and turned around, only to see that the television in the living room was on. It was a picture of a pianist playing the piano. In front of the sofa, on the carpet, under the incandescent light. Chapter 3060. This desire opened up a little. It couldn't be taken back. Perhaps the old man was right. He clearly had 1,000 ways to drive her away. But in the end, he didn't do anything. It was just the result of the youth's restless nature. He had always been self-disciplined and was unusually calm and restrained. This girl, he didn't think he liked her that much. But he didn't hate her too much. But he had to admit that she seduced him. This kind of seduction was naive and didn't understand the world, directly rushing into his heart. It brought out his restless youth's beastly nature. Ding! The male lead's favorability has increased to 15. Fu Yuheng came out of the bathroom, naked as he dried his hair. His eyes were hidden in his messy black hair. The corners of his eyes were red. He casually put on his home clothes, then opened his notebook and began to organize the meeting content. He planned to use it when the meeting started at 12. He wouldn't be able to sleep well tonight. He was young, so it was normal for him to stay up all night to work out. Fu Yuheng suddenly had a beastly thought in his heart. He didn't feel anything strange. He didn't panic. It was just a natural feeling. He just had to endure it. Wei Wei Bai finished her yoga and felt refreshed. She looked at the favorability and calmly said, "This guy really can endure." Fu Yuheng's age was the most impatient age. The result was similar to an old man with erectile dysfunction. Even if the favorability fluctuated, it couldn't be seen from the outside. She tidied herself up, then yawned, and went to the kitchen to find supper. When the system saw her enter the kitchen, it immediately put down the game in its hand and stared at the host. It was afraid that she would blow up the kitchen again. After eating supper, she rubbed her full stomach and walked to the third floor. Fu Yuheng had already organized the meeting materials. After saving it, he saw that it was almost 11. He got up and planned to go downstairs to drink water. It was so late, she should be asleep. This thought flashed through Fu Yuheng's mind. He calmly opened the door, but saw Wei Wei Bai standing outside, about to knock. He paused, but the girl had already crashed into his arms. For a moment, Fu Yuheng knew that he could dodge, but his feet seemed to have grown roots. He stood there indifferently, allowing the young girl's body to rub against his chest. That faintly discernible sweet fragrance and her soft body temperature squeezed past him. Wei Wei Bai's indifferent voice sounded. "The hot water in my room is broken. Let me borrow your bathroom." With that, she ran straight into the bathroom.
Bang!
The bathroom door closed. Fu Yuheng stood in place, his fingers still holding the doorknob. He lowered his eyes in silence for a while before opening the door unhurriedly. After going downstairs, he opened the fridge and took out some ice water. He leaned against the fridge door and slowly drank it. When the ice water entered his throat, his Adam's apple bobbed, but he found that the temperature of his skin was already very high. He casually placed the cup on the table and returned to his room. The clear sound of running water came from the bathroom. He supported his chin with his hand expressionlessly and stared at the bathroom door with his dark eyes. After waiting for a long time, the sound of water disappeared. The door suddenly opened a crack, and the girl's fingers stretched out from the door. "Fu Yuheng, I forgot to take my clothes. Lend me your shirt." Under the light, her beautiful fingers were as smooth as powder. Her wet skin was unusually tender and alluring. Fu Yuheng's eyelashes fluttered, and he stared at her fingers without moving, until Wei Wei Bai said impatiently, "Fu Yuheng, are you deaf?" He slowly got up, walked to the closet in an unusually obedient manner, and took out a white shirt. Then he walked to the bathroom door and was about to hand the shirt to her. Wei Wei Bai was still muttering, "Are you a man?" dilly-dallying. Just as her fingers touched the shirt, she found that the other corner of the shirt was pulled, and she couldn't move it at all.
She was just about to complain.
But suddenly, she found that her wrist was tightly gripped by the other party's fingers, and a huge force dragged her out. Chapter 30:61. She staggered out, and the door was kicked shut by the youth. Then, he pressed her against the door. His fingers clasped her wrist and pressed it against the top of her head. The girl who was arrogant just a moment ago now had panic in her eyes. She had just finished bathing and was wrapped in a towel. She was as delicate as a glutinous rice dumpling as she stared at him. She was like a pitiful little girl who had fallen into a trap. Fu Yuheng's beautiful eyes slightly raised. He held her slender and fragile wrist with one hand. A trace of lazy frivolity appeared in his deep eyes as he sized up her body from top to bottom. His gaze could even be said to be impudent and bold. His unrestrained gaze was filled with a man's sense of aggression. When he lowered his head, he could even see her flustered eyelashes trembling. Her eyes shrunk as she avoided his gaze. Her beautiful skin was pink. He slowly reached out his other hand and pressed down on her lips with wanton force. "Are you that eager to seduce me?" His voice was incomparably hoarse, and his breath had a trace of hot breath. As if he couldn't control himself, he took another half step forward and forced her against the door. There was no space to dodge, and she could only shrink in front of his chest. Under the youth's thin shirt was a warm chest with a slightly hurried heartbeat. The usually fresh breath had an ambiguous seduction because of the heat. His fingertips trailed from her lips to her delicate jawline. Wherever his fingertips rubbed against, there was a tingling sensation of electricity. The girl stared at him with wide eyes. Her lips finally trembled, and she choked out a sentence. "You beast." When Fu Yuheng heard this sentence, his movements paused, and he finally couldn't hold back his laughter. The laughter was muffled, but it was surprisingly pleasant to hear. He whispered softly, "I'm a beast. Aren't you the one who deliberately put on a posture to seduce me? I let you off so many times, but you clearly marked the price and rushed over, insisting on blaming me. How much is your price? I'll give you more." There was no respect in his tone. It was as if he was looking down from a high and mighty position. It was as if everything about her was in his hands. Since she started blushing at him. This was the beginning of the seduction, wasn't it? Just like her mother, she always used all kinds of tricks on her guests. Pretending to be innocent and pitiful, blushing was probably just a survival skill for them. He did not want to pay any attention to her. He was busy with work and gave her enough. He did not care about how much money his mother, Bai Xiuyu, had squeezed out of his father. Or would he allow her to have such bad grades and open the back door for her and send her to the best school? These were the results of real money and connections. She was greedy and wanted more. She had taken a fancy to him. It was just like what he had told his grandfather. However, she was allowed to run around like a cat or a small pet. It wasn't that he had feelings for her. It was only because she was pretty. At his age, no matter how mature he was, he couldn't resist his body's instinct to like someone as beautiful as her. The only special thing was that she was the only girl in all these years that he felt was beautiful in every way, to his liking and his heart. That was all. There were no other feelings. It was just his body's instinct. He pushed against her while enjoying the reflection of his face on her beautiful face. Her eyes were clear and bright because of her anger. Fu Yuheng used his fingers to gently rub the skin of her slender, white neck and felt her tremble. Fast, fast, forward slash, fast, fast, fast. Chapter 3062. She struggled to break free from his shackles. "Get away from me, Fu Yuheng." Just as his fingertips brushed against her collarbone, a cold light flashed across her eyes. She trembled violently, and then she was completely furious. Fu Yuheng's eyes were deep, and his fingers suddenly exerted force, pinching her shoulders. She was caught off guard and gasped. But she suddenly felt that the young man's lips were already on her neck. He was so calm that it was almost cruel, and his breathing was not even a little messy. Only the hot breath exposed his uncontrollable invasion. The soft kiss was more like the last gentleness of a beast with its prey in its mouth. His voice was casual and dangerous. "You came here yourself, Wei Bai. Even if I do anything to you now, you asked for it. Not leaving this place. Wearing revealing clothes every day, and being defenseless. She even risked her life to get close to him. Then don't blame him for thinking too much." Just as he was about to act presumptuously, the girl's knee suddenly pushed up with force. Suddenly, his pupils shrank, his muscles tensed, and his grip on her loosened. This action was too unexpected. It caused the young man, who had always been strategizing, to be stunned for a moment. Then, her pair of slender and fragile fingers flashed her nails and scratched at his face fiercely. "Fu Yuheng, you bastard, I hate beasts like you the most." She bared her fangs and brandished her claws at him, scratching and slapping him. The young man, who had never encountered such a terrifying attack, couldn't even think straight. He could only let her hit him like this. And it hurt down there. He sucked in a deep breath and finally reached out to grab her. Suddenly, he found that her bath towel was loosened, and the scenery under the bath towel was clear. His face suddenly turned red, and in pain, he looked away in embarrassment. Wei Bai had a sarcastic look on her face as she pulled the bath towel back. "What are you looking at? You're wearing underwear. Haven't you seen other people wearing bikinis? What are you pretending for, you beast in human clothing?" Fu Yuheng's body was bent over. His hair was messy, and there were several bloody scars on his face. His eyes were dark, and there was finally a hint of anger that belonged to someone of his age. Just as he was about to reach out to grab her, he found that Wei Bai immediately jumped away and ran towards the door in a panic. She sneered as she ran. Fu Yuheng, I like you, but that's not a reason for you to behave like a hooligan. If you show me some respect, we're both adults. What's the big deal? I'm seducing you, so what? She ran to the door and grabbed the handle. The young girl fiercely turned her head, her clear and beautiful eyes filled with a breathtaking aura. You idiot. Why don't you go to the heavens when I'm selling you? You haven't even grown out your hair yet. Do you think you can look down on others just because you have more coffin money accumulated by your ancestors? You're lucky that I'm interested in you, idiot. You actually made a deal for something that was consensual? Is there something wrong with your brain? After saying that, she spat fiercely. Go to hell. I'm blind for liking you. After saying that, she slammed the door and then gave it a fierce kick. After the violent maniac left, the embarrassed youth finally reached out to support himself against the wall and stood up with a pale face. His mind was still in a daze. He didn't know why things had developed to this point. He felt that his brain, which was usually very useful, was now being dragged along by the other party's jumping rhythm. He completely couldn't understand what he had done wrong. // Chapter 3063. Fu Yuheng put his hand on his waist and felt that it was still painful. But strangely, he wasn't angry. He looked at the door and was silent for a while. Then, he bit his lip, walked slowly to the sofa, and sat down. The pain came quickly, but it was mostly gone after a while. Tiny bits of pain came from his face. He reached out and touched his face. To his surprise, he found traces of blood. He thought about his rashness just now and carefully recalled what he said just now. He did look like a prostitute. He was just stunned for a moment, but he wasn't stupid. His impulsive attitude just now was not only because he was blinded by her temptation, but also because he was looking forward to it. After all, if she really took the initiative to hug him and ask for the material price, he would be disappointed. This kind of vague feeling of relief was a little ridiculous. But at least he could be sure that she was not like Bai Xiuyu at all. Fu Yuheng rubbed his face and frowned when he felt the pain. She was like a stray cat, and the kind that hadn't been tamed. Fu Yuheng sighed slightly. He felt that he had been paying too much attention to her recently, and his methods were despicable. Dealing with a little girl. These methods and words were a little despicable. Fu Yuheng, who had always been expected to follow the rules and behave like a young master of a big family. For the first time, he knew how despicable he could be. They were in these circles. There was no shortage of animals to bully women. He didn't expect that he was one of them. He sat in silence for a while, then slowly got up and opened the bathroom door, intending to take a cold shower to calm down. But just as he walked in, he saw the girl's shorts and suspenders thrown to the side of the bathtub. His eyes froze. After being speechless for a while, he walked over and picked up the clothes. The clothes were so small. He glanced at the suspenders. Why were they so small? He couldn't help but tug at the suspenders and found that they were elastic, and very elastic. The clothes perfectly wrapped around the girl's slender body. It revealed the young but beautiful lines of her body. After tugging for a while, he realized how perverted his actions were. The young man, who was planning to do something worse than a beast, couldn't help but blush. He pursed his lips and put the clothes in the laundry basket. In the end, he saw that the clothes he had just thrown here when he was showering were tangled with her clothes. Just looking at it made one's head heat up. He looked at it expressionlessly and realized that he couldn't stay still. The bathroom was filled with an unfamiliar, soft scent. This feeling of having his territory invaded was actually not uncomfortable, but it was very troublesome. His breathing was a little disorderly as he silently lowered his head. His deep eyes carried traces of uncontrollable trembling. His heart palpitated slightly. Ding! The male lead's favorability is at 20. After Fu Yuheng calmed down, he walked out of the bathroom with an indifferent expression. He originally wanted to go downstairs to drink water. He thought that she might be scolding him downstairs. He lowered his eyes and hesitated for a moment before giving up on the idea of going downstairs. For the first time, he was in his own home. It was almost like living under someone else's roof. Fu Yuheng turned back to the computer. It was time for the meeting. When he opened the video, he realized that his face was still covered in blood. Meanwhile, the employees who had just come online and their business partners were instantly amused. Fuck, little boss, who did you just fight 300 rounds with? That's too explosive. Fu Yuheng looked up coldly with an expressionless face.
/T.
Chapter 3064. However, he had always been cold and steady. The little boss who beat them up every day and suppressed them to the point of death. To think that he had actually exposed his pathetic side. It was a young company. The young employees were even more fearless and laughed. It's good to be young. You can still continue to work. Little boss, don't stay up all night. You have a girlfriend. If you stay up all night and lose your hair, your little girlfriend will run away. Fu Yuheng, the panda who was surrounded by onlookers, bent down calmly and took out the first aid kit from the drawer. Then, he calmly took out the OK tape and looked at himself in the video as if he was a mirror. He stuck the OK tape on the wound on his face. He didn't feel embarrassed at all. He was terrifyingly calm. Those laughing and joking voices also gradually disappeared. Even under the calm of the Demon King little boss, everyone gradually felt the terrifying pressure again. Demon King Fu stuck the OK tape on the bridge of his nose and one on his cheek. After he was done, he unhurriedly took out a stack of documents, spread them out, and began to read out a bunch of projects. Some people need to go on a business trip. Whoever was the most enthusiastic just now will go. After saying that, Fu Yuheng read out the location of the business trip. They were all in small countries in the third world. If they went, there might not be anyone left. Suddenly, a bunch of people fell on their faces and begged for mercy. Wei Bai, who heard the favorability notification, turned over, wrapped herself in the blanket, and closed her eyes to sleep. The host and system were as calm as an old dog. They weren't interested in the fluctuation of favorability. But the system, who was knitting a small hat for itself, still asked, "Is the male lead a masochist?" He was kicked so badly, but his favorability still rose. Wei Bai explained in a daze, he's not a masochist, but he's emotionally blank and still naive. So when he sees a girl who isn't moved by money, it's easy to have favorability. No matter how steady and mature Fu Yuheng looked, he was still a 19-year-old kid. No matter how good his family education was, he wasn't thrown into the slums or the assassin camp to train. No matter how good he was in other things, it didn't mean that he was very emotional. How could a boy of this age not have a hot-blooded side? He was really a mature driver. Not to mention that she wanted to use the bathroom. Even if he really stripped naked and forced himself on her, he would not feel anything. But at Fu Yuheng's age, not to mention borrowing a bathroom, if there was a girl in the family, there would definitely be a different feeling in his heart. Of course, the prerequisite was that the girl was pretty. Yes, that was what she looked like. No other girl can compare to her. Therefore, it would be strange if the little boy did not panic. Wei Bai sighed. I'm so beautiful. That's why it's so old-fashioned, girl. I like you. How dare you insult me with money? I'll beat you to death. Boy. This girl actually likes me and not my money. She's so pure and not pretentious. She's just different from those flirtatious cheese outside. That's right, that's how the favorability would increase. His tricks were so trashy. Even Fu Yuheng had taken the bait. Sure enough, her beauty had played a huge role. Why are you boasting again? Could it be that you're hinting at me to buy some skincare products again? When the system thought of this, it silently opened the supermarket catalog. Oh, there's a delicate and soft essence. Not expensive. Throw it on the host. There's also a lip protector, the kind that has a sweet taste when kissing. It guarantees that the lips will look so good that there's no need to wear lipstick. Not expensive. Apply it on the host. Wei Bai, who is sleeping. Chapter 3065. Wei Weibai felt that she had become prettier again. She looked at herself in the mirror, and her keen sense of beauty was immediately activated. Like a radar, it swept across her face. Yes, her lips had become prettier. She frowned. Could it be that her beauty could be updated automatically? When she woke up early in the morning, her mood immediately improved. She washed her face, then picked out a more conservative short-sleeved t-shirt from the closet. Not to mention the collarbone line. She didn't even have a bra line. Didn't Fu Yuheng dislike her for showing off? She was starting to be conservative. Bai Weiwei had always disliked the idea of having too many tricks up her sleeve. Living under someone else's roof was the age of fire. A single man and a single woman. It was like a peach that had just ripened. If she didn't do some tricks, how could she live up to her beautiful youth? She wore long jeans, which were super loose, and a flat-chested t-shirt. She walked out in her slippers. It was only 7:00. The nanny had probably just finished preparing breakfast. She went to the dining room. She saw Fu Yuheng sitting at the dining table. He had glasses on the bridge of his nose, and his eyes were still clear behind the glasses. If it weren't for the shadow of staying up late, she felt that he had just woken up. Wei Weibai ignored her and pulled out a chair. The nanny came over and served her porridge. She casually thanked him. The nanny glanced at her but didn't say anything. It was just that there were more side dishes and deep-fried dough sticks for her. The Fu family's breakfast was usually bland. An overly refined diet was not popular. After all, the appetite was too delicate and was not good for health. Wei Weibai didn't think so much. It was fine as long as the food was delicious. Fu Yuheng had just finished eating and was sitting at the dining table reading the newspaper slowly. For a moment, there was only the sound of the girl eating silently at the dining table. Through the gap in the newspaper, the young man slowly looked up and saw the clothes she was wearing. His eyes were stunned. These days, he was used to her little suspenders and shorts. For a moment, it was a little strange to see the girl dressed so conservatively. Her long hair was tied into a simple high ponytail, and her beautiful hairline was casually scattered, natural little hair and some fine strands of hair. Her beautiful face was filled with the purity and beauty of youth. Even if it was just a simple t-shirt and trousers, it still looked very fresh. Fu Yuheng stared at her for a few seconds before he forced himself to look away and read the newspaper. However, he realized that the words on the newspaper were densely packed. This caused him to become distracted. Fu Yuheng read the newspaper calmly, but he couldn't understand a single word. Suddenly, he heard a young girl's soft but incomparably cold voice. "I'm moving out." He tightened his grip on the newspaper and remained silent for a while. Only then did Fu Yuheng calmly put down the newspaper, revealing his calm and handsome face. Wei Weibai looked up and met his eyes. There was not a trace of hesitation in his eyes, nor was there any intention of dodging. She put down the unfinished youtiao and wiped her hands with a napkin. The young girl's beautiful fingers were fair and tender. Her round nails were stained with some oil and were slightly red and alluring. She wiped her hands nonchalantly and said, "I'm sorry to have troubled you for so many days."
Although it was an apology.
However, his tone was still filled with anger. There was no sincerity in apologizing at all. It was extremely perfunctory. Wei Weibai looked at the young man's calm face and said very calmly, "After all, you've already found me a good university and promised that you'll pay for my university tuition and living expenses. One can't be too heartless." Chapter 3066. At this point, she paused for a moment. "So, if you want me to leave, I'll leave obediently." After saying that, her lips curled up into a nonchalant smile. After all, I'm not the kind of person who can be so thick-skinned and refuse to leave. Fu Yuheng stared at her deeply for a few seconds before reaching out to take off his glasses. Having not slept for a night, his eyes were a little blurred, and his hair was a little messy. The young man with the decadent aura had a kind of stunning dark and beautiful temperament. His expression was cold. "When are you moving out?" Neither of them mentioned what happened last night, but it was still like a bomb. The atmosphere between them was tense to the point that it smelled of gunpowder. Wei Wei Bai lazily lifted her eyelids and said coldly as if he didn't care, "These 2 days, I'll pack my things." Fu Yuheng was silent for a moment before saying indifferently, "Do you have a place to stay?" Wei Wei Bai got up and replied indifferently, "Why are you wasting your time? Even if I sleep on the streets, it's none of your business. Besides," at this point the girl smiled, cold and mocking, "am I not just a prostitute in your eyes? Are you afraid that I don't have a place to stay? In your heart, my sugar daddy's bed is enough for me to sleep in." This sentence was meant to provoke. It could even be said to be presumptuous and unreasonable. Fu Yuheng's expression was indifferent, and his eyes narrowed slightly. After all, he was a pampered person who was used to being in a superior position. For a moment, he didn't like being pointed at and mocked. He was about to retort when he looked up and saw the girl in front of him. Her beautiful eyes showed a hint of unwillingness to avoid his gaze. She was as sharp as a hedgehog. Only in the light of her eyes, there were remnants of hurt softness. Fu Yuheng kept all the words in his mouth and didn't say a single word. After Wei Wei Bai finished speaking, she was stunned for a moment. It seemed that these words were indeed unpleasant to hear. She was silent for a moment before laughing self-deprecatingly. "Forget it. I'll leave once I'm done packing. In the future, when my mother is chased away, remember to inform me." Speaking of her mother, her voice weakened. "She's just vain. She might not stop when she sees that your father is rich. You should keep an eye on her." Wei Wei Bai finished speaking and was about to leave. However, he heard the calm voice of the youth behind him. "If your mother succeeds in staying, won't your life be better?" It was better to be gentle with this sentence. To put it bluntly, if Bai Xiu succeeded, Wei Wei Bai could also become a phoenix from a pheasant. She paused in her footsteps, her back facing him. For some reason, she felt a sense of bleakness and fragility. At last she spoke in a flat voice. "You can live as long as you have money, okay? All I know is that my life has long been ruined. No matter how much money you give me, it won't give me a normal mother, let alone a normal childhood." Here she said in a low voice of derision, "You're so lucky. Don't always talk about other people. If I were you, I would also write you a check and ask you to sell it to me." These words were slightly gloomy. It was as if she was choking. "I only liked you for a few days. It doesn't mean that you can always hold on to this mistake of mine." Liking him was a mistake. Fu Yuheng's eyes froze. The girl had already left the dining table and walked up the stairs. She turned back. There was no trace of sadness on her face. "In the future, I won't overestimate myself and like a young master like you. Don't worry." After saying that, she went upstairs without looking back. From beginning to end, she didn't look at him. Fu Yuheng sat on the chair, his eyes deep and cold. His white fingertips touched the newspaper. After a long time, he picked up the newspaper and continued reading. But he found that he couldn't read it. Last night, to her, was it too much? Ding. The male lead's favorability is at 25. To read the full article, download to read the full article. Chapter 3067. Fu Yuheng found that the house had suddenly quietened down. It was the hottest time of the summer vacation, and the heat was everywhere. He had been busy outside for several days, and only returned home after 10 at night. If it was in the past, he might have just stayed in the apartment next to the group and rested for a few nights. After all, it was a critical period for the group's transformation recently. After dealing with too many people, he began to suffer an unimaginable backlash. Many people began to band together to resist the policy of excluding him. He knew that once this difficulty passed, it would be considered to be over. The old man's life before retirement would be much better. He would also get a few years of free time to develop his own company. At such a critical time, he clearly didn't need to come back. When Fu Yuheng opened the door, the living room was empty. It was still the same as before, empty and bright. There was no sign of life. He took off his shoes, and his suit jacket hung at his elbow. Traces of sweat had already appeared on his white thin shirt. The faint lines of muscles on his back and the thin outline of his waist were exposed. The air conditioner in the room seemed to be broken. He looked up at the air conditioner. He found that it wasn't on. He walked over and picked up the remote control, but found that it really couldn't be turned on. Fu Yuhun couldn't help but feel a little irritated. He walked straight to the refrigerator, opened the door, and saw the food left by the nanny who cooked. Some girls liked ice cream, sugar water, and watermelon in a bowl that had been cut and sealed with plastic wrap. All of this happened when he was alone. Things that didn't exist. He took out the cold mineral water, opened the lid, and drank 2 mouthfuls. The dry and hot feeling was still there. Fu Yuhun looked at the fruit and sugar water in the refrigerator expressionlessly. It was mung bean soup. He tilted his head and thought for a moment. Finally, he hesitated for a moment before taking out the fruit and the frozen mung bean soup in a glass bowl. When he returned to the room, he put the things in a more conspicuous place on the table. He also cleaned up the documents and debris on the table. The air conditioner in the room wasn't broken, and it was always on. Fu Yuhun went to take a shower expressionlessly. After taking a shower, he glanced at the door of the room. No one had opened it. He lowered his eyes and stood there for a while, then calmly went to organize the work documents. The computer was on, and there was a game at the bottom of the desktop that had not been deleted. He raised his eyebrows and stared at the game. Once again, he had the urge to delete it. But for some reason, his finger almost went in. It was a login page for the game. As for the nickname and password, it was saved and could be accessed directly. He hesitated for a moment before logging in. Nickname, Chiomi-iko. He stared at Chiomi, unable to understand what she meant. But he instinctively felt that it was cute. After logging in, he was greeted by a colorful immortal cultivation screen. All the servers were packed with people. He glanced at the game, then opened the search page and searched for the game company. He realized that it was a company that he had invested in. This year, a game had exploded in popularity, making his investment extremely successful. But to him, this was much more profitable than an investment. It was still just a small addition to his performance plan. It was completely insignificant. As a result, he had no recollection of it at all. In a game with an immortal cultivation background, all the characters were beautifully designed. He glanced at the character that Wei Wei Bai had chosen. It was Daman. Chapter 68. He was a Buddhist disciple, holding prayer beads in his hand. He was bald and wore a kasaya. Fu Yuhun was speechless. What was going on with this name? It was a little strange. He glanced at the game and wondered why he even logged in to take a look. After logging in, he stared at the game and hesitated for a few seconds before giving up on the urge to delete it. After all, it was a game that he had invested in. He could occasionally check its performance. Fu Yuhun convinced himself and continued reading the documents after taking a sip of water. After reading for a while, he glanced at the door again. After a few seconds, he calmed down and continued reading the documents. Then he signed, closed the document, and continued reading the next document. 11:30 p.m. She didn't seem to have eaten supper. For some reason, this thought flashed through Fu Yuhun's mind. He rationally and coldly suppressed this thought. He felt that he had been paying too much attention to Wei Wei Bai recently. He didn't even think that this was a feeling of fondness. It was just that he felt that he had gone overboard. Then he felt a little guilty. This bit of guilt was a novelty to him. After all, he had destroyed so many people, and he had just watched indifferently. Yet, he felt a little guilty towards a little girl who was living under someone else's roof. Fu Yuhun thought about it for a while. Perhaps it was because those people he had destroyed were his enemies, his opponents, and all of them were strong. He saw it as a challenge. The winner takes all, and there was nothing to say. But Wei Wei Bai wasn't like that. She was weak and even pitiful. Bullying her would make him seem inhumane. Fu Yuhun stared at the document and finally pushed it aside. Then he glanced at the sweet soup on the table. He hesitated for a while. This was the first time he had experienced such a strange hesitation. Finally, he was strong enough to take action. He picked up the green bean soup and walked up to the second floor. Fu Yuheng came to Wei Wei Bai's door and knocked. He found that no one answered. He frowned. At this time, she wasn't here? Could it be that she had moved away? As soon as this thought came to him, he opened the door without much consideration and found that it wasn't locked. He was really caught off guard. He saw that the room was indeed empty. Furthermore, the air conditioner was not turned on, and a stuffy feeling rushed towards him. Fu Yuheng's fingers tightened around the bowl. Then, he glanced at the furnishings in the room. Half of the things were already packed. The suitcase was placed on the bed, and the clothes were scattered all over the bed. There were 2 big bags beside the bed, which seemed to be the girl's own luggage. The bag was a little shabby and cheap. He looked at it for a while, then moved his eyes away indifferently. Then he walked to the living room and put the soup on the table. The air was still stuffy. He sat on the sofa, waiting for something. As time passed, he finally heard the sound of the door opening. And her voice on the phone. That's right. Come and help me move my things tomorrow morning. My mom thought that I could stay here for a long time, so she put all my things here. It's very troublesome for me to move them out first. Moving companies are too expensive. I'm penniless now, so I can only stay at your place for a few nights. Wei Wei Bai said as she slowly ate her ice cream. She didn't notice that there was another person in the living room. It seemed that the person on the other side of the phone was in a dilemma. Wei Wei Bai smiled. Brother, you're the best. You definitely can't bear to let me out on the streets. Don't worry, I'll cook for you, wash your clothes, and do anything to repay you. Chapter 3069. When the delicate and pretty girl smiled, the corners of her lips curved up like a blooming flower. Her eyes were filled with gentleness. It was as if she was about to confess in the next moment. The young man sitting on the sofa's eyelashes trembled slightly. He slowly lifted his eyelids, revealing the deep coldness in his eyes. He watched her slowly walk up the stairs. Perhaps it was because of the heat. The t-shirt she was wearing was casually tied at the waist, revealing the fair skin of her waist. The girl's waist was extremely slender, without a trace of excess flesh. They were all tender and fair, and when he touched them, it was as if it could turn into sweet water and wrap around him. Fu Yuheng's dark eyes coldly looked at the slender figure. When she walked up the stairs, he could still vaguely hear her flirting with the person on the other end of the phone. His gaze fell on the green bean sugar water. After a long time, he slowly got up, picked up the bowl, and walked to the kitchen to pour it out. That bit of guilt was turned into a dark and sharp thing by the girl's careless tone of betraying herself. It actually made him a little angry. Wei Wei Bai returned to the room, smiled, and put down the phone. The phone screen was still black and it was even locked. It didn't look like it was on the phone. She didn't make a call at all. She just saw little brother Fu Yuheng sitting on the sofa, a little lonely and pitiful. If she let him get some stimulation, he wouldn't be lonely. She was a good person. She took the phone to charge, and Wei Wei Bai turned on the air conditioner. Then she started to pack. The best strategy was of course to be in the same room. But she couldn't really be stubborn. The character was the key. Don't get involved with Bai Xiuyu. Even if you don't live here for a while, you can still meet her when you're in school. When the time came, it would be a youthful and fresh campus romance. It was also good. Wei Wei Bai chatted with the system for a while. The system was knitting a big hat for Wei Wei Bai. The storm in the space-time tunnel was very cold. After he knitted a hat for himself, he wanted to knit one for her. When the time came, she would wear it on her soul. It wouldn't be cold. They were both knitted from the same sweater. It was a festive sight to see one big and one small. As he knitted, he said, "There's still a long time, so it doesn't matter where you go. But where do you want to live after you go out? You don't have enough money in your bank account to live." Wei Wei Bai, "I'll report to school in advance. I'll just stay in the dormitory." As they discussed, they packed their luggage. Wei Wei Bai realized that she was hungry. She had only eaten an ice cream and had not eaten dinner yet. She thought of the supper that was always prepared in Fu Yuheng's kitchen. She rubbed her stomach and felt that the best thing about Fu Yuheng's place was that the supper was delicious. Wei Wei Bai yawned and looked at the time. It was already 12 o'clock. Most likely, the traumatized teenager had gone to sleep. Or stay up late to work. It was good to be young. In a few more years, with such crazy work, the possibility of sudden death would be high. She went to take a shower first before walking down the stairs. Her footsteps were light. He planned to go to bed after eating supper. Greasy old salted fish's conqueror was unusually calm about everything. The system also went to sleep. In the empty living room, there was only Wei Wei Bai softly humming a cheerful song. She went to the kitchen and first looked at the thermos. It was empty. Then she looked at the rice cooker. It was empty. Not only was it empty, it had not been washed. It seemed that the food had just been eaten, and only the pot was left. Her calm heart was at a loss. Then she went to the refrigerator to look for something.
Tea.
Chapter 3070. The fridge was more than half empty. There was basically only mineral water left. The rest of the snacks, fruits, desserts were all gone. Wei Wei Bai's expression turned cold.
Who was it that ate all the food?
Did Fu Yuheng have guests today? Were there more than 10 naughty kids? Otherwise, how could they eat so much? She suddenly smelled something at the tip of her nose. Normally, she would not notice this kind of smell. But in the middle of the night, she was hungry again. She smelled all kinds of smells, especially the sweet smell of food. She opened the trash can to take a look. The trash can was full of food. Then, she looked at the place where the kitchen waste was placed. Damn it, all the food was poured into a bucket. Wei Wei Bai, she clutched her stomach, her face full of grief and indignation. Fu Yuheng, you wasteful bastard. For someone who was hungry in the middle of the night, it was painful to find that all her food had been thrown into the trash can. It made people want to kill her to keep her mouth shut. What was worse was that many of the snacks' packaging were deliberately torn open. It was to prevent the contents of the snacks from being contaminated by the trash can. It made her want to go against her conscience, pick up the packaged snacks, wash them, and then open them for new snacks, but she couldn't do it. Fu Yuheng was too ruthless. He even killed her heart. How could rich people spoil snacks, desserts, and fruits like this? Fu Yuheng looked at the fruits on the table indifferently. He forgot to throw them away. He got up and was about to throw them away. But then, there was a loud knocking sound on the door. Fu Yuheng stopped in his tracks and looked at the door coldly. His expression didn't change as he picked up the fruits and walked to the trash can. The door suddenly opened. As soon as Bai Weiwei pushed open the door, she saw the son of a B***TCH holding the last glass bowl of fruit. He was going to throw it into the trash can. She didn't say anything and ran over immediately. But just as her fingers touched the fruit, the youth in front of her looked up calmly and loosened his fingers. Just a second before Weiwei Bai touched the fruit fell into the trash can with a thud. Weiwei Bai, not only did he hurt her heart, he even insulted her stomach. Fu Yuheng looked at her coldly before he took a tissue from the table and wiped his hands. He threw it into the trash can and covered it with the fruit. Weiwei Bai was angry. She suddenly reached out and grabbed his finger. She said fiercely, "Fu Yuheng, I'm about to leave, and you won't even give me this bit of face before I leave. Why are you deliberately bullying me?" Her fingers were a little cold. Her body's fragrance was the coolness after a bath. It was just like the ice cream she ate. Her soft lips were stained with the color of the ice cream, and the feeling of her tongue licking it lazily. Fu Yuheng didn't expect that he would remember that scene so clearly with just a glimpse. Perhaps it was because he had held back for too long. That was probably why he was so angry. His fingertips twitched, and the girl tightened her grip. She glared at him coldly, her beautiful eyelashes fluttering like a butterfly's wings. His eyes were also stained with fire because of his anger, and it was incomparably clear. Fu Yuheng lowered his head and said, "Let go." His voice was so low that it was close to gentleness. But this gentleness gave people the dangerous feeling of a venomous snake. Bai Weiwei sneered, "If you hate me, just say it directly. Just directly scold me. We can directly fight." What I hate the most is that kind of indifference on the surface, but behind it, at https://www.
Sashu.
/quick to read the full text. https://www.
Sashu.
// to txt download the full text. https://www.
Sashu.
/quick to read the full text. https://m. Sashu. /quick. Chapter 30, 71. She looked him up and down. Her cold smile turned into sarcastic sarcasm. A eunuch who only knows how to scheme behind his back. After saying that, she shook off his hand as if venting her anger. I'll leave tomorrow so that I don't have to see a two-faced bastard like you. After saying that, she raised her proud little head and turned to walk towards the door. The door was open. Before she could walk out of the door, a hand firmly pressed against the door in the next moment. The half-open door was pressed down hard. There was a loud bang.
The door closed.
Wei froze for a moment. Before she could react, a huge force pulled at her arm. Then her whole body was pressed against the door by this force. The youth's strong aura attacked her. He didn't even stretch out his hand to hold the door and form an encirclement. Instead, he directly pressed his body against hers. With an incomparably strong posture, he squeezed out the space she had to escape. Her body pressed against him. She felt the youth's hot skin that was close to boiling. His face was still cold, and his beautiful eyes were dark, so dark that she couldn't see the bottom. It made the slow-witted girl feel a sense of fear in hindsight. It was like a hunter who had been hibernating in the grass for a long time and finally revealed his sharp claws to fiercely slap the small animal eating grass. And the small animal was dumbfounded. She didn't even know that her appearance had attracted a man-eating monster. Fu Yuheng saw that her appearance was fierce but cowardly. At this moment, she had already revealed panic, as if she had finally sensed the danger and wanted to avoid it. But he calmly reached out his hand, passed through her smooth long hair, and clasped her slender neck. His fingertips rubbed against her soft skin. He used so much force that it was close to bad, leaving red marks on her skin. He lowered his head and kissed her without saying a word. This kiss was more like a young boy's, eager, crazy, and with a kind of rudeness that didn't pity her at all. He clasped her in his arms and did whatever he wanted. He ignored her struggle, and tiny traces of blood appeared in his dark eyes. There was no trace of intimate gentleness. There was only a sense of naked aggression. This kind of shameless invasion bordered on criminal. It was more like he was venting his anger. The youth had been hiding it for too long, and he couldn't suppress the anger that only people of his age would have. Impulsive and reckless. It was even a form of revenge. When the young man felt that the beast in his heart was slightly satisfied, he gently lifted his eyelids, his dark eyes incomparably evil. Then he left her, but his fingers didn't leave the back of her neck. He was practically holding her down, making it impossible for her to escape or even move. Fu Yuheng lowered his eyes and licked the corner of his lips slowly. He looked at the girl's frightened eyes, and his thin red lips curled up slightly. His voice was hoarse. The taste of the ice cream is very good. Wei Bai moved her lips before she reacted. Anger appeared in her eyes, and she was about to say something. However, he saw him lower his eyes and reveal an expression that was not a smile. "Brother?" he whispered. These two words were spoken with a hint of viciousness. His usual politeness and elegance had disappeared at this moment. Only the vicious side of the young man's heart had emerged. The dark night was beneficial for his cold side to appear. His breathing was still rapid and strong. He lowered his head and leaned over slowly, his thin lips touching the corner of her lips. Little by little, his lips kissed upward. He felt her tremble in fear. "You're so reserved with me, but I don't know how many brothers you've acknowledged outside." // Chapter 3072. His voice was low and hoarse, suppressing a hint of viciousness. You call me brother so smoothly. So it's because you're used to it. She casually called him brother. In the end, seeing that he didn't take the bait, she directly kicked him away. Then she ran outside to call that wild man brother. To her, could she just casually grab a man and call him big brother? He didn't even have time to figure out what his feelings were. But he knew very well. At first, he liked her cuteness. No matter how calm he was, how much he had seen the world, and how experienced he was. At his current age, he was still full of vigor. He liked a girl's cuteness, even if it didn't involve love. But his desire for her was there. This desire made him want to make a deal with her. But he was rejected. He wasn't angry. For a moment, he even felt that she was naive. He didn't find it strange that a girl of this age was naive. She didn't understand the temptation of wealth. Even if she had a bad mother, she wasn't affected. Maybe she would change in the future. But now, this naivety even made him see her in a new light. He also felt guilty for offending her. After all, he did have a dirty mind towards her. Fu Yuheng's scary kiss came to the corner of her eyes, and he felt her eyelashes trembling. He said in a low voice, his voice hoarse, "Don't you like to call people brother? Try calling me brother." The fingertips on the back of her neck tightened a little. This was a silent oppression. The girl trembled, and her voice weakened. "Let go of me, Fu Yuheng." She didn't dare to anger him. Her rough temper was just a paper tiger that knew that he wouldn't be angry. Fu Yuheng didn't spoil her. He said word by word, "Call me brother." In his threatening tone, there was a faint hint of anger that was about to erupt. Not to mention a little girl, even the group of elders who were older than him. Under his tone, they would tremble. Sure enough, Wei Bai couldn't take it anymore. She bit her lower lip so hard that it turned red. "Brother," her voice was almost inaudible. Fu Yuheng smiled. His smile didn't feel noble or elegant at all. Instead, it was an evil aura that made people afraid. He replied lazily, "Well, since you're going to be my slave and cook," he paused when he saw that she looked like she wanted to run away. He couldn't help but reveal a sinister smile. "Then I'll take you in. From now on, you'll do my laundry," and he wanted to say that he was going to cook. But he thought of the exploding egg. Fu Yuheng swallowed his words. He let go of her neck and then pulled open his collar with his fingertips. The buttons were pulled open one by one, revealing his fair skin. Wei Bai leaned against the door and looked at him with a pale face. "What are you doing?" After Fu Yuheng took off his clothes, his upper body was bare, and he threw the clothes on her head. Wei Bai was stunned. The clothes that covered her head smelled strongly of a young man. She hurriedly tore off her clothes. Fu Yuheng reached out and lifted her chin. His eyes were deep. "Stay at home tomorrow. Until I chase you away, you'll stay here." Wei Bai grabbed the clothes tightly and was about to raise her head to resist. But she thought of something and shrank back. She only glared at him with a pair of angry eyes. Fu Yuheng glanced at the clothes in her hands and said coldly, "I'll give you a chance to be my slave. Wash the clothes in my hands." Chapter 3073. After he finished speaking, his upper body was bare, and his face was as calm as a beast dressed in human clothing. "Also, if you want to leave, think about your mother." He paused and enjoyed the girl's panic. "Then," he said slowly, "during this period of time, she has spent more than 1 million on luxury accessories. If you don't want me to pursue this money or even all her future expenses, then stay here obediently." As he said, it was too easy for this group of people to keep a girl. All kinds of despicable and insidious methods were as simple as drinking water and eating to them. "Anyway, if you like, stay. I don't like to let you go." Fu Yuheng's eyes were still dark. He looked at Wei Bai, who was holding his clothes in a daze. He chuckled softly. "Do you understand?" These words were indescribably frivolous and unrestrained. Once the elegant skin was removed, the beast inside was completely unsightly. He took another step forward and lowered his voice a little. He said threateningly, "Do you understand?" He had never liked to repeat himself. But he didn't know that at this moment, the power that was above him made him ask one sentence every time. Until she was afraid. The dark and vicious mentality in his heart would be fed a little. Wei Wei Bai grabbed his clothes tightly. Tears came out of her eyes as if she was afraid that he would do something terrible again. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. Only then did Fu Yuheng reveal a gentle smile. He reached out and gently rubbed the top of her head. He enjoyed the smooth and tender feeling of her hair. He said softly, "I don't like the color of your hair. Black looks better." It sounded like a suggestion, but it was an order. Wei Wei Bai's eyelashes fluttered. She bit her lower lip and suppressed the urge to refute. Fu Yuheng didn't seem to understand how scary he was. His cold eyes were already dyed with a devilish color. The demon in his heart was out of control. The aggression that had been suppressed for so many years was now aroused by the girl in front of him. He didn't intend to hide it. He had suppressed it for so long, but she didn't appreciate it. Don't blame him for exploding. Fu Yuheng calmly let go of her and even pulled her. Her legs went weak and she stumbled. Then, he pulled her to his single-seater sofa and pressed her down on it with ease. The young man spoke softly, as if he was talking to his beloved child. "You must be hungry. Wait for me here obediently." After saying that, he smiled and pulled the clothes back from her hands. He smiled gently. "I won't really make you do the laundry and cook. You don't need to do that when you're with me." After all, he had a lover. They should be pampered and raised. If he raised them too crudely, it would be a disgrace to him. Fu Yuheng was very familiar with the way things worked in his circle, but he had never put it into practice.
He was too picky. He was a little obsessive-compulsive.
Just one look was enough to annoy him. Wei Wei Bai was truly the apple of his eye. Everything about her was exactly what he liked, except for his personality. Even though he hated her the most at the beginning, the moment he saw her, the first time he saw her, he wanted to plunder her. She was like a clumsy pigeon, flapping her two tiny wings. She kept riding on his head and clucking. She thought that if he wasn't angry and didn't react, she could go even further. Fu Yuheng calmly put on his clothes while looking at Wei Wei Bai, who was curled up on the sofa and looking at him with vigilance and fear. He casually stretched out his fingertips and tugged at his collar, revealing his beautiful neck. His sexy Adam's apple rolled slightly. This was a subtle action that was too seductive. Chapter 30-74. But it was caught by the girl in front of him. Her pupils shrank as she tried to shrink back. She almost sank into the sofa and turned into a small ball. Fu Yuheng calmly looked at her before walking out the door. He closed the door and then went downstairs. When he opened the refrigerator in the kitchen, he pursed his lips. When the girl struggled, he bit the skin on his lip. Ding! The male lead's favorability has increased to 30. Then he took out the ingredients that he didn't throw away and began to make supper. For simplicity, he made noodle soup. The clear soup was filled with chopped green onions. The noodles were just right. This was one of the simplest ways to cook. For the youth, it was as simple as boiling an egg. Wei Wei Bai was wiping her mouth. There was no other way. The other's kissing skills were too unsightly. Chicks just couldn't do it, biting and kissing people. She was lucky that he didn't bite her lip until she went bald. The system suddenly yawned. What happened just now? I was suddenly blocked. She was sleeping well when she suddenly heard the sound of blocking, and all kinds of blocked messages surrounded her. Although she had already calmed down. But it was still strange. Wasn't the host going to sleep? Why was it suddenly blocked? Could it be that the male lead suddenly went wild and rushed into the host's room to do something to her? No. Something worse than a beast? In the end, when the block was gone, the host was in the male lead's room. Wei Wei Bai wiped her lower lip and calmly replied, "It's nothing big. It's just that a young man suddenly went crazy and came to take advantage of me." The reason for the increase in favorability was very simple. He was lusting after her. A man's early favorability due to lusting after her was very quick. But to increase it later, it required a beautiful heart-to-heart exchange. 30 favorability was the early increase. The beauty of youth was very simple to make a youth lose control. Then the favorability couldn't be controlled and increased. This had nothing to do with her personality. It was purely because she hadn't seen the world. First love, first time. With such a combination, it was actually quite easy to pull up the favorability. After all, many people's eyes were blind for their first love. Even if he was treated like an ATM, cheated on, or exploited. I still feel that my first love is the best. I just can't bear to give it up. Torture me to death. My first love is my life. When he grew up, he realized that he had been blind back then. He wished he could strangle himself to death for loving his first love. Yes, this is youth. Stupid, easy to give up everything, easy to increase the favorability of youth. Furthermore, Wei Wei Bai touched her face. I feel that after using those beauty products, Fu Yuheng looks at me like a hungry wolf looking at meat. Although she was indeed good-looking. But it seemed that those beauty products would automatically approach Fu Yuheng's aesthetic. Sometimes, if it wasn't a devastatingly beautiful woman, then everyone would like her. After all, people had different aesthetic values. Her appearance seemed to fit Fu Yuheng's aesthetic standards. Otherwise, he would have thrown her out long ago. How could he tolerate her acting like this? In the end, he directly threatened to make her his mistress. TSK, public morals were deteriorating day by day. This child was teachable. To read the full article phone to facilitate your next reading, you can click on Chapter 30, 75. The system glanced at the beauty and skincare products it had bought. No, they were all normal skincare products. Other than the good effect and the long time, there were no other problems or advantages. As for the male protagonist being attracted by the host's appearance, rather than being attracted, it was more like a soul attraction. If this body were to change souls, it would probably have no effect at all. It couldn't be helped. After so many worlds, the Linghu fragment had remembered the host's soul aura. It liked this aura. Even in the face of a severed plane world, without any memories, and even with resentment because of the invasion of foreign souls. It still liked her aura. That was why she always made the male protagonist feel that he had found someone with his aesthetic standards. The host was just asking casually and didn't continue to investigate. The door suddenly opened, and Fu Yuheng walked in with a tray. He put 2 bowls of noodle soup on the table, and then looked at Wei Wei Bai, who was still sitting obediently on the sofa. It had always been a room where he was alone, and the feeling of having another person was actually not that unbearable. He sat on the chair by the table and said to her, "Eat some supper and then rest well." Wei Wei Bai glared at him, and then looked at the noodles. She looked at him again. Fu Yuheng ignored her, slowly picked up his chopsticks, and then stirred the beef slices on the noodles, mixing them with the noodle soup. Chopped green onions, enough beef slices, and vegetable pieces, accompanied by noodle soup and noodles. It looked delicious. His voice was low. "If you don't eat, I'll do something else." Wei Wei Bai. Fu Yuheng picked up a piece of beef, drained the soup, and put the beef to her lips. The young man smiled gently. "Eat, be good." These words were filled with a desire to control, even if it was said in such a gentle tone. Wei Wei Bai was quiet for a while, then her lower lip trembled, and after opening it, she put the beef into her mouth. Fu Yuheng took back the chopsticks and said, "Do you want me to feed you, or do you want to eat yourself?" Wei Wei Bai immediately picked up the bowl and began to eat the noodles. The noodles were especially delicious. Maybe he was hungry. Wei Wei Bai said to the system, "This young man has a bright future. If this continues, he'll probably take out the contract and make a 3-point agreement." This was just one of the steps of keeping a mistress. Of course, this was just a casual joke. After finishing the noodles, Wei Wei Bai wiped her mouth with a tissue. Fu Yuheng walked to the table, took out a piece of paper, and typed on the computer for a while. Then it was printed out on a small printer. He brought the paper to the table and took out a pen. He said to her, "Take a look and see what else you want to add." Wei Wei Bai looked at him blankly. Then his gaze fell on the paper. Terms 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Of course, there was no such unsightly word as keeping. Instead, He had subtly written the word companion instead. Society, society. She didn't learn anything good, but she was so flirtatious. She immediately blushed and finally couldn't hold it in any longer. She shouted, "Fu Yuheng, you're crazy. You've insulted me enough." As soon as this sentence came out, Fu Yuheng looked up and his eyes became dark and gloomy. "You don't like these terms?" His voice was cold and filled with the ruthlessness of a man as it slowly rang out. He didn't rise and fall, nor did he shout. He didn't even move his body. But that kind of oppressive coldness made people's legs go weak. Chapter 3076. Although Wei Wei Bai was trembling under his aura, she still resisted with a stiff voice. "You're committing a crime and threatening me. Why can't I see that you're a beast?" Fu Yuheng opened the cap of the fountain pen and wrote some material conditions on the paper slowly and elegantly. "I'll give you an extra shop in a prime location in the city center. Even if you don't know anything in the future, you can rent it out for your living expenses." It was his first time keeping her. He was very generous. If he could use material things to get rid of her, he felt that it was not a problem. These words seemed to provoke Wei Wei Bai's sensitive nerves. She gritted her teeth and sat on the sofa, looking like she was going to run away at any time. Fu Yuheng wrote a few more things. He was meticulously thinking about her living expenses in the future. Of course, she did not have to think about these problems when she was with him. But in the future, his contract with her would end. As long as she did not mess around, her quality of life would still be maintained at a relatively high level. After he finished writing, he turned to the side. Then the youth looked up slightly and saw that her eyes were red. She felt wronged and angry. He was silent for a while before putting the fountain pen in front of her. "Sign your name." Wei Wei Bai finally said with a stiff neck, "You're crazy. How can this thing have legal effect? Even if you force me to sign it, it doesn't count." Fu Yuheng's eyes were dark. He looked at her quietly for a few seconds before saying calmly, "There's no legal effect, so it doesn't matter if you sign or not. I'm giving a notice, not." The last few words were said slowly, but it was full of deterrence. "I'm discussing with you." After saying that, he reached out and grabbed her wrist so tightly that it was frightening. He almost dragged the girl over. Wei Wei Bai immediately retracted, but she found that she could not break free. Fu Yuheng had already turned his face slightly. A trace of coldness appeared on his fair and handsome face. "Do you know what time it is? The quality of the soundproof wall in the house is not bad." This sentence did not have a beginning and end, but she heard his low and magnetic voice. If she did not care about the content of his words, it was very seductive. His voice was heavy. "It's late at night, and there's only you and me at home. You're a girl. If I want to do anything to you, are you sure you can run away?" This was the consequence of her own actions. At first, he let her go. Yet, she came to provoke him and wanted to stick to him every day. She had no concept of the power between men and women. He didn't even seem to care. Under the same room, she really treated him like a eunuch. He didn't covet her? Or did she think that he was a good person? Fu Yuheng's eyes were slightly cold. His thin lips curved up slightly, revealing a trace of a gentle smile. "You're a good kid. You know how to sign, right?" Wei Wei Bai thought, "This black wolf cub is actually a little scary." It was like a rerun of the trilogy of the Ring of the Midnight Bell. Moreover, he was right. It was late at night and they were both alone. If that lonely man was a psychopath, a murderer, or a sadist, it was indeed a nightmare for a girl. If she wasn't his target, she would have believed that he was a real pervert. Wait a minute, were there any normal people among her targets? Well, there should be a few. She didn't know if she could gather a hand. Wei Wei Bai's hand was held by him, and he stuffed a pen into her hand. Then, she signed her name in a crooked manner. She glanced at the contract. There were a bunch of things on it that were for her. After calculating, she was really worth a lot of money. Then there were the conditions. Listen to him, listen to him, listen to him. 3 consecutive words of emphasis. That was all. Fu Yuheng kept the contract. Of course, he knew that there was no legal effect. It was even a little child's play. But when he stuffed the contract into his safe and put it together with the contracts of those major projects, suddenly, he couldn't help but smile as if he had completed the most important transaction in his life. The voice of the girl behind him was a little scared. She whispered, "Can I go now? I'm going to sleep." Fu Yuheng locked the safe. When he heard this sentence, he paused. He turned back and looked at her with deep eyes for a while before saying in a gentle voice, "Listen to me. Tonight, your bed will be in my room." Bai Weiwei. At the crossover system, Adonis, come here and read the full article at https://www.
Sashu.
Download the read the full text. 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 You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.